My name is Bella Parker, and I am 31 years old. The waiter set a heavy silver platter of cracked stone crab claws on the white linen tablecloth. The crushed ice underneath caught the dim amber lighting of the high-end Coconut Grove restaurant. It was a sweltering October evening in Miami, marking the official start of stone crab season, but I felt freezing cold. I stared at the bright orange shells resting on the ice. I could not breathe. Sitting directly across from me at my own 30th birthday dinner was Marcus, the man who broke my heart 10 months ago. Sitting next to him, sipping a mint mojito and laughing at a joke my father just told, was his new girlfriend. She looked barely 24, with perfect sun-kissed skin and a designer sundress. I did not deliver a witty comeback. I did not offer a polite greeting. My body betrayed me in real time. My palms sweat profusely in the heavy tropical humidity. My chest tightened until my ribs ached. My hands shook so badly that my beaded evening clutch slipped off my lap. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp crack, scattering my keys, lipstick, and phone across the walkway. Welcome back to Sofia Told Stories, where quiet women stop protecting the reputations of the people who hurt them. Before I share exactly how I turned this humiliating birthday ambush into a corporate legal battle that cost my parents their entire retirement plan, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you believe toxic families deserve the reality checks they bring upon themselves. I knelt on the floor in my silk dress, frantically gathering my scattered belongings. My face burned with intense humiliation. My parents, Richard and Valerie, did not reach down to help me. They did not even pause their conversation. They ran a boutique marketing agency in South Florida, and I was their lead digital strategist. For years, I kept their business afloat, managing complex campaigns and building back-end infrastructure, while they schmoozed at yacht clubs and charity galas. They operated entirely on optics and leverage. When I finally surfaced from under the table, clutching my belongings, I looked at Marcus. He shifted awkwardly in his chair, pulling at the collar of his expensive linen shirt. He avoided my gaze, staring instead at the condensation dripping down his glass. It became obvious very quickly that he did not know the true nature of this dinner. Richard and Valerie had likely invited him under the guise of a casual agency networking event, encouraging him to bring his new partner. They used my milestone birthday as bait to get him to the table without raising his suspicions. The reason for this cruel theater was simple. Marcus was the son of a wealthy New York real estate developer. His father was a snowbird who migrated to Palm Beach every winter, bringing millions of dollars in potential advertising contracts with him. My parents desperately wanted that account to fund their impending retirement in the Florida Keys. They viewed my romantic history not as a personal heartbreak, but as a squandered networking opportunity. They invited my ex and his new girlfriend to my birthday dinner to show me what I threw away and to court his father's business right in front of my face. The waiter poured crisp, dry white wine into our glasses. Richard leaned forward, ignoring my flushed cheeks and shallow breathing. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder with exaggerated familiarity. "I hear your father is expanding the luxury condo project down in Brickell," Richard said, his voice dripping with faux camaraderie. "We should get him on the golf course next week. Parker Media is ready to handle the entire digital rollout for those properties. We have the best local market penetration in the city." Marcus gave a stiff, uncomfortable nod, glancing sideways at his girlfriend, who was happily dipping a crab claw into mustard sauce. "I will mention it to him, Richard," Marcus replied, his tone strained. Valerie took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her eyes scanned my simple outfit, her expression calculating and cold. She leaned back in her chair, adjusting her posture to project effortless authority. "Well, it is wonderful to see you doing so well, Marcus," Valerie said, pitching her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "We always knew you were driven. Some people understand what it takes to build a real future." She turned her gaze toward me, her voice dropping into that specific patronizing register she used to demean me during our board meetings. Unlike Bella, Valerie continued gesturing toward me with her wine glass. She spends her free time playing with that little weekend coding hobby of hers. I keep telling her that writing tracking software will never amount to real marketing. You have to be out in the world making connections, securing tangible assets. She is 30 now. The clock is ticking on settling down and getting serious. The jab was designed to shrink me down to size. She dismissed the proprietary analytics software I spent my nights building, reducing my grueling, high-level technical work to a pathetic hobby, all to elevate Marcus and stroke his fragile ego. She was telling the table that I was a failure, a woman running out of time while Marcus was a success story. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the waters of Biscayne Bay lapped against the docks. Sailboats bobbed in the warm evening breeze. It was a picture-perfect Florida postcard, but the air at our reserved table felt thin and toxic. My stomach churned. The rich smell of melted butter and garlic hanging in the restaurant air made me physically nauseous. I looked at the two people who raised me. They were willing to humiliate me on the night I turned 30, seating me across from the man I used to love just to secure a real estate contract. They sold my dignity for a chance at a snowbird developer's money. I took a slow breath, forcing oxygen past the tight knot in my throat. I looked at the new girlfriend. She was oblivious to the warfare happening across the white linen. She complimented my mother on her necklace, and Valerie beamed, soaking up the validation. I realized then that they did not care about the pain they were causing me because my pain was a required currency for their success. They had calculated the cost of my heartbreak and decided the potential return on investment was worth it. The panic that had caused me to drop my clutch slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. I realized in that sweltering restaurant that my parents did not see me as a daughter. They saw me as an employee, a prop, and a tool to be discarded when I no longer served their financial interests. And the only way to survive a toxic corporate machine is to dismantle its operations from the inside out. I placed my hands flat on the table. The trembling had stopped. The frightened daughter who had walked into the restaurant was gone, replaced by the lead digital strategist who knew exactly how much power she held over the Parker media infrastructure. The heavy silver platter clattered against the crisp white linen tablecloth, sending a small shower of crushed ice over the edge. A mountain of freshly cracked Florida stone crab claws rested in the center, bright orange and imposing. The waiter poured a rich mustard dipping sauce into small porcelain ramekins, the sharp tang of the mustard cutting through the heavy tropical air. I was sitting inside a high-end waterfront restaurant in Coconut Grove. The evening air pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows was thick with October humidity. It was my 30th birthday dinner. I was not walking through the front doors to a surprise party. I was already seated. I was trapped. Sitting directly across the table from me was Marcus. We had dated for 3 long years before a very messy, very painful breakup just 10 months prior. The wounds were still fresh, the kind of fresh that makes your chest ache when you see a familiar car on the highway. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with him sipping a mint mojito and laughing at a joke my father just told was his new girlfriend. She looked barely 24. She possessed perfect, sun-kissed skin, a designer sundress, and the carefree ease of someone who had never experienced a genuine hardship in her life. To my immediate left sat my parents Richard and Valerie. They ran Parker Media, a boutique marketing agency based in South Florida. I was their lead digital strategist. For years, I kept their business afloat. I managed the complex digital campaigns, built the back-end tracking infrastructure, and handled the late-night crisis calls while they spent their afternoons schmoozing at yacht clubs and charity galas. They operated entirely on optics leverage and appearances. I did not deliver a sharp, witty comeback. I did not raise an eyebrow smirk or pour a glass of water over anyone's head. My body betrayed my brain in real time. My palms began to sweat profusely, slipping against the heavy linen napkin draped across my lap. My breathing grew shallow and rapid, the classic markers of a panic attack taking hold. My hands shook so noticeably that my beaded evening clutch slid right off my lap. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing crack. My car keys, a tube of coral lipstick, and my phone scattered across the walkway, drawing the attention of the surrounding diners. Welcome back to Sofia Told Stories, where quiet women stop protecting the reputations of the people who hurt them. My name is Bella Parker. I am 31 years old now, but this story takes you back to the night I turned 30. If your parents used your milestone birthday to ambush you with your ex for a business deal, would you walk out or fight back? Tell me below, because my choice cost my parents their entire retirement plan. Hit that subscribe button if you believe toxic families deserve the reality checks they bring upon themselves. I knelt on the floor in my silk dress, frantically gathering my scattered belongings. My face burned with intense humiliation. My parents did not reach down to help me. They did not pause their conversation or ask if I was all right. Richard was already waving his hand to flag down the waiter for a second round of drinks. When I finally surfaced from beneath the edge of the table, clutching my belongings to my chest, I glanced at Marcus. He shifted awkwardly in his upholstered chair, pulling at the collar of his expensive linen shirt. He stared intently at the condensation dripping down his water glass, pointedly avoiding looking at my flushed face. It became obvious very quickly that he did not know the true nature of this dinner. Richard and Valerie had likely invited him under the guise of a casual agency networking event. They told him to bring his new partner. They used my milestone birthday as the perfect bait to get him to the table without raising his suspicions. The reason for this cruel theater was entirely financial. Marcus was the son of a prominent New York real estate developer. His father was a wealthy snowbird who migrated to Palm Beach every winter, escaping the northern cold and bringing lucrative property portfolios and millions of dollars in potential advertising contracts with him. My parents desperately wanted that account. They needed it to fund their impending luxurious retirement down in the Florida Keys. To Richard and Valerie, my romantic history was not a personal heartbreak. It was a squandered networking opportunity. They orchestrated this ambush to show me what I threw away and to court his father's business right in front of my face. The waiter poured crisp, dry white wine into our glasses. Richard leaned forward, ignoring my shallow breathing and my shaking hands. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder with exaggerated familiarity. "I hear your father is breaking ground on that luxury condo project down in Brickell next quarter," Richard said. His tone dripped with faux camaraderie. "We should get him on the golf course next week. Parker Media is ready to handle the entire digital rollout for those properties. We have the best local market penetration in the city." Marcus gave a stiff, uncomfortable nod, glancing sideways at his girlfriend. She was happily cracking a stone crab claw with a small wooden mallet, oblivious to the warfare happening across the white linen. "I will mention it to him," Richard, Marcus replied, his tone strained and eager to change the subject. Valerie took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her eyes scanned my simple outfit, her expression calculating and cold. She leaned back in her chair, adjusting her posture to project effortless authority. "It is wonderful to see you doing so well, Marcus," Valerie said, pitching her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "We always knew you were driven. Some people understand what it takes to build a real future." She turned her gaze toward me. Her voice dropped into the specific, patronizing register she used to demean me during our board meetings. Unlike Bella, Valerie continued gesturing toward me with her wine glass. She spends her free time playing with that little weekend coding hobby of hers. I keep telling her that writing tracking software will never amount to real marketing. You have to be out in the world making connections, securing tangible assets. She is 30 now. The clock is ticking on settling down and getting serious. The jab was designed to shrink me down to size. She dismissed the proprietary analytics software I spent my nights building. She reduced my grueling high-level technical work to a pathetic hobby, all to elevate Marcus and stroke his fragile ego. She was telling the table that I was a failure, a woman running out of time, while Marcus was a success story. The restaurant hummed around us. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the dark waters of Biscayne Bay lapped against the wooden docks. Sailboats bobbed in the warm evening breeze, their masts swaying gently under the glowing Miami skyline. It was a picturesque Florida evening, the exact kind of scene they print on tourism brochures to attract the demographic my parents were currently chasing. But the air at our reserved table felt thin and toxic. The rich smell of melted butter and garlic hanging in the restaurant air made my stomach churn. I looked at the two people who raised me. They were willing to humiliate me on the night I turned 30. They seated me across from the man I used to love just to secure a real estate contract. They traded my dignity for a chance at a snowbird developer's money. I took a slow breath, forcing oxygen past the tight knot in my throat. I looked at the new girlfriend. She complimented my mother on her necklace. Valerie beamed, soaking up the validation, like dry earth absorbing rain. I realized then that my parents did not care about the pain they were causing me. My pain was simply a required currency for their success. They had calculated the cost of my heartbreak and decided the potential return on investment was worth it. The initial terror that had caused me to drop my clutch slowly began to recede. It left behind a cold, clinical clarity. I realized in that sweltering restaurant that my parents did not see me as a daughter. They saw me as an employee, a prop and a tool to be discarded when I no longer served their financial interests. If they wanted to play a high-stakes corporate game at my birthday dinner, I was going to oblige them. The frightened daughter who had walked into the restaurant was gone. The lead digital strategist, the woman who knew exactly how much power she held over the Parker media infrastructure, took her place. I placed my hands flat on the table and signaled the waiter. I placed my hands flat on the white tablecloth and signaled the waiter. He approached with quiet efficiency, gathering our empty appetizer plates and wiping away a few stray water droplets. Instead of excusing myself to the restroom to cry in a marble stall, I forced myself to sit back and endure the remainder of the dinner. I needed to see exactly how far my parents were willing to take this charade. The initial panic had burned out, leaving a cold, sharp focus in its wake. Richard leaned over his plate of stone crabs, ignoring his expensive seafood in favor of securing a business deal. He launched into a relentless pitch, throwing around marketing jargon with practiced ease. He talked about conversion rates, digital footprints, and targeted demographic acquisition. He treated Marcus not as a former part of our lives, but as a walking bank account. Marcus nodded politely, though his eyes darted frequently toward the exit. He looked like a hostage trapped in a timeshare presentation. Valerie chimed in, whenever Richard paused to take a breath, filling every silence with calculated flattery. She steered the conversation toward the new girlfriend, asking invasive, fawning questions about her youth and her career. When the girl mentioned she was 24 and working in fashion merchandising, Valerie sighed with performative nostalgia. "To be 24 again," Valerie said, resting her chin on her hand and gazing at the girl. "The world is so open at that age. You have plenty of time to make mistakes and find the right path. It is so much harder when you hit 30. The options just dry up, the market gets competitive, and you have to settle for whatever you can get. Do they not, Bella?" I smiled, a thin, tight expression that did not reach my eyes. I refused to let the insult penetrate my skin. My focus had shifted entirely away from their toxic dialogue and onto the floor beneath the table. During my earlier panic attack, my phone had slid further under my father's chair. I leaned down, apologizing softly for my clumsiness, and ducked beneath the heavy linen drape. Beneath the table, shielded from view, I spotted Richard's heavy leather laptop bag resting against the leg of his chair. He took that bag everywhere, treating it as an extension of his own arm. The top zipper was pulled back a few inches, exposing the silver edge of his work computer. Plugged into the side port was a small silver USB drive. It was unassuming, just a tiny piece of metal and plastic, but I knew exactly what it held. That drive contained the master encryption keys for our entire agency backend. I had generated those keys myself to protect our client databases and campaign metrics. I reached for my phone on the floor, allowing my other hand to brush against the side of his laptop. With one smooth, silent motion, I pinched the silver drive and pulled. It slid out of the port with a faint click, perfectly masked by the ambient noise of the crowded dining room and the sound of the girlfriend cracking a crab shell above me. I closed my hand around the drive, retrieved my phone, and sat back up. The USB drive went straight into my beaded clutch. I snapped the metallic clasp shut. The lock to the Parker Media Kingdom was now sitting in my lap. I sat up straight and caught the eye of the sommelier passing by our table. He stepped over immediately, presenting the leather-bound wine list. I did not ask my father for his credit card. I ordered a bottle of the restaurant's most expensive vintage champagne. It was a rare, high-end French label that cost more than a standard monthly car payment. Richard paused his pitch to Marcus, raising a surprised eyebrow at the order. Valerie offered a tight, approving smile. In their minds, I was finally playing along. They thought I was putting on a display of wealth and sophistication to impress my ex-boyfriend and win back his affection. They assumed I was falling in line, performing the role of the successful, desirable daughter to help them secure the lucrative real estate account from his father. The sommelier returned moments later with a silver ice bucket resting on a folding stand. He presented the dark green bottle, popped the cork with a muted sigh, and poured the pale golden liquid into 5 crystal flutes. The bubbles rose in rapid, pristine columns, catching the amber light of the dining room. I picked up my flute by the slender stem. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished marble floor, and stood up. The table went quiet. Marcus looked up, freezing like a deer caught in headlights. His new girlfriend stopped picking at her meal. Richard and Valerie sat back in their chairs, wearing identical expressions of smug anticipation. I raised my glass toward Marcus. I kept my voice steady, projecting just enough volume to hold the attention of our table without causing a public scene. To Marcus, I began my tone pleasant and entirely devoid of sarcasm. It is genuinely good to see you doing well. I want to toast to your new relationship. May it bring you all the clarity and happiness you are looking for. To new beginnings. Marcus exhaled a visible breath of relief. He lifted his glass to meet mine, a weak smile forming on his face. We all took a sip of the freezing crisp champagne. I lowered my glass, but I did not sit back down. I turned my gaze away from my ex-boyfriend and focused directly on my parents. And speaking of new beginnings, I continued. The pleasant warmth drained out of my voice instantly, leaving behind a sharp professional chill. I want to take this opportunity to make an announcement regarding my own future. Effective immediately, I am officially resigning from my position as lead digital strategist at Parker Media. The reaction was instantaneous. The air vanished from the table. Richard froze. His mouth hung slightly open, a piece of crab meat hovering near his plate on the end of a silver fork. Valerie's manicured hand tightened around the stem of her crystal flute until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes widened, the smug satisfaction fracturing into genuine, unadulterated shock. They stared at me, their brains struggling to process the string of words I had just spoken. For a decade, they had treated me as a permanent fixture, an endless resource they could exploit, without consequence or adequate compensation. They spent their days networking, playing golf, and drinking cocktails, leaving the actual mechanics of their business entirely to me. I managed the content calendars, optimized the tracking pixels, built the websites, and handled the server maintenance. Without me, Parker Media was just a hollow shell of business cards and empty promises. Richard did not know how to log into his own client portals. Valerie did not know how to interpret basic analytics. I will not be returning to the office on Monday, I stated, maintaining my calm, even cadence. I suggest you cancel your golf plans next week, Richard. You are going to need that time to figure out how to run your own deliverables. I did not wait for them to mount a defense. I did not give them the opportunity to yell, negotiate, or guilt-trip me in front of their prized guest. Marcus was staring at his plate, suddenly acutely aware that he was caught in the middle of a catastrophic family detonation. I unclasped my evening bag, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills, and laid them neatly next to my untouched dinner plate to cover my portion of the extravagant champagne. I took one final deliberate sip from my crystal flute, savoring the dry finish of the wine on my tongue. I picked up my clutch, turned my back on the silent table, and walked away. I navigated through the crowded dining room, passing tables of oblivious tourists and wealthy locals, until I reached the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant. I pushed them open and stepped out into the balmy Miami night. The salt-tinged breeze swept off the bay, wrapping around my shoulders like a warm embrace. The crushing anxiety that had suffocated me all evening was gone. It was replaced by a thrilling, terrifying realization. I had just initiated a full-scale professional war against my own family. I walked toward the valet stand to hand the attendant my ticket, blissfully unaware that my mother was currently sprinting through the restaurant lobby, preparing to bring the conflict straight to the parking lot. The valet attendant took my crumpled ticket and jogged toward the back of the crowded parking lot to retrieve my car. A sudden violent tropical thunderstorm had ripped through Coconut Grove, an hour before the dinner began, a frequent occurrence in late autumn. The asphalt was slick, covered in deep, dark puddles that mirrored the vibrant neon pink and electric blue lights of the surrounding Miami skyline. The air smelled of wet pavement ozone and salt. I stood under the canvas awning, drawing deep breaths of the humid night air, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just done. I had resigned. I possessed the master encryption keys in my clutch. The bridge was not just burned, it was completely incinerated. "Bella, wait right there." The voice cut through the ambient noise of the nearby street traffic like a cracking whip. I turned around. My mother Valerie was marching out of the heavy glass restaurant doors, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking aggressively against the wet concrete. She bypassed the waiting line for the valet stand and marched directly toward me. Her face was flushed, her jaw tight, but she was not projecting the frantic fury of a woman throwing a temper tantrum. Her anger was dense, grounded, and terrifyingly cold. "What exactly do you think you are doing in there?" Valerie demanded, closing the distance between us. "You do not make public announcements like that in front of a prospective client. You get back inside right now, you apologize to your father, and you tell Marcus it was a poorly timed joke." "I am not going back inside, Mom," I said, keeping my tone as even as possible. "It was not a joke. I resigned. You and Dad set me up. You used my 30th birthday to ambush me with the man who broke my heart just so you could pitch a digital marketing contract to his father. I am not an employee you can sacrifice for a networking opportunity." Valerie stopped a few feet away from me. The neon lights cast harsh shadows across her face, illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion she usually kept hidden beneath careful makeup. The patronizing smirk she had worn at the dinner table was entirely gone. In its place was a raw, naked panic. "You think this is about a networking opportunity?" she scoffed, her voice dropping into a harsh, ragged whisper. "You think I care about your feelings getting hurt over a boy? Bella, look at the world around you. Love does not pay a mortgage. Romance does not keep the lights on. Wealthy real estate developers pay the bills. Marcus comes from old money. His family owns half the commercial property on the coast. You do not walk away from that kind of security because your pride is bruised. You secure the asset. You play the game." I stared at her, the sheer callousness of her worldview knocking the breath out of me. She was not denying the ambush. She was actively defending it as a necessary business strategy. "I do not want to play the game." I argued, my voice beginning to shake. "I want a partner who respects me. I wanted a mother who actually cared about my happiness on my birthday, instead of using me as a pawn to secure her own retirement fund." Valerie's expression hardened. The panic in her eyes did not recede, but it sharpened into something deeply defensive. She did not yell like a cartoon villain. She spoke from a place of profound, unresolved terror. "You have no idea what it takes to survive," Valerie spat, taking a step closer. "You grew up in a 4-bedroom house in Coral Gables with central air conditioning and private tutors. You think stability just magically appears because you work hard. It does not. I know what happens when you refuse to play the game. I lived it." The air between us grew dense. The memory of her childhood, a topic she rarely breached, hung in the humid night like a physical weight. Valerie did not grow up attending yacht clubs or dining on stone crabs. She grew up in a rusted, single-wide trailer parked on a swampy, mosquito-infested lot near the edge of the Everglades. Her father, my grandfather, had been a stubborn, prideful man who ran a small boat repair business. He refused to compromise, refused to network with the wealthy marina owners, and refused to play the political games required to secure lucrative contracts. Valerie had watched her father lose the business. She watched the bank foreclose on the trailer park land to build a luxury resort. She spent her teenage years swatting insects in the dark because they could not afford the electricity bill. She married Richard, a smooth-talking salesman with ambition, because she viewed financial security as the only valid metric of a successful life. She was terrified of sliding back into the swamp, and she projected that desperate survival mechanism onto every decision she made. "I am trying to save you from ruining your own life," Valerie continued, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "If you marry a man with no resources, you will spend your entire life grinding just to stay above water. Marcus is a golden ticket. I put him in front of you tonight to remind you of what you are throwing away. I pushed you to get serious because the world does not care about your feelings, Bella. It only cares about your bank account." The tragedy of her perspective hit me with the force of a physical blow. She genuinely believed her cruelty was a form of protection. She thought she was being a good mother by forcing me into a lucrative marriage and a profitable business deal. Her obsession with Marcus and his family was a trauma response, a desperate attempt to insulate us from the poverty she had escaped. But her trauma did not excuse the abuse. It did not justify turning my milestone birthday into a transactional nightmare. "I want a mother." I pleaded, the tears finally spilling over my lower lashes. "I do not need a corporate manager, Mom. I do not want to be your golden ticket. I want to build my own life on my own terms." Valerie stared at my wet face. The vulnerability she had shown for a fraction of a second vanished, locking away behind a fortress of cold, defensive pride. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her expensive silk dress. "You want to build your own life," she said, her voice dropping into a freezing, dismissive register. "Go ahead. But understand this, Bella. You are nothing without Parker Media. You do not have the name, the connections, or the capital to survive in this city alone. The Miami marketing scene will chew you up and spit you out. If you walk away tonight, do not expect us to catch you when you fall. You will fail and you will starve." The valet attendant pulled my small, practical sedan up to the curb, leaving the engine running. He stepped out and held the door open pointedly, looking away from the intense family drama unfolding under the awning. I did not offer a rebuttal to her curse. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, stepped around my mother, and slid into the driver's seat of my car. I pulled the door shut, cutting off the humid air and the sound of the nearby traffic. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, leaving Valerie standing alone under the neon lights. The drive back to my apartment in the Brickell neighborhood was a blur of blurred streetlights and heavy, suffocating grief. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale. I was not feeling the triumphant adrenaline-fueled high of a woman who just quit her toxic job. I was actively mourning. I was mourning the realization that my mother's love was not maternal. It was entirely conditional upon my financial utility and my willingness to sacrifice my own happiness to secure her status. I parked my car in the cramped, narrow garage beneath my apartment building. The reality of the situation began to settle over me as I rode the slow elevator up to my floor. I had drawn a massive, irreversible boundary. I had walked out on my job, my parents, and the only professional network I had ever known. The emotional victory of the restaurant resignation was rapidly giving way to the terrifying logistics of survival. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the dark, quiet space. I dropped my beaded clutch onto the kitchen island. I unclasped the metal latch and reached inside, pulling out the small silver USB drive I had slipped from my father's laptop bag. I set it on the granite counter. The master encryption's keys were safe. I possessed the leverage I needed to protect my own proprietary work. But leverage alone does not pay the rent. Monday morning was approaching fast, and when the sun rose, the reality of my impulsive resignation would manifest in a brutal, immediate professional crisis that would test my endurance and push me to the very edge of financial ruin. The weekend passed in a heavy, humid haze. I spent Saturday and Sunday confined to my small apartment in Brickell, ignoring the relentless barrage of text messages and voicemails from both Richard and Valerie. I needed the isolation to process the emotional whiplash of the birthday dinner, but I also needed the silence to prepare for the logistical nightmare I had just invited into my life. By the time the sun rose over Biscayne Bay on Monday morning, casting long golden shadows across the high-rise buildings, the adrenaline of my resignation had completely metabolized. What remained was the cold, harsh reality of unemployment. I brewed a pot of strong Cuban coffee, the bitter, dark roast a necessary shock to my system. I set up my personal laptop on the small granite kitchen island. I needed to act quickly. Before I could begin pitching my services as an independent consultant to the competitive Miami marketing scene, I needed to compile my portfolio. I needed to download the campaign histories, the return on investment metrics, and the digital pitch decks I had personally authored during my tenure at Parker Media. I opened my web browser and navigated to the agency remote access portal. I typed in my employee credentials, a username and password combination I had used thousands of times over the past decade. I hit enter. A red banner flashed across the screen. Access denied. Account disabled by administrator. I paused, staring at the error message. I refreshed the page and carefully retyped my password, ensuring the caps lock was not engaged. I hit enter again. The same red banner appeared. Access denied. My father had moved faster than I anticipated. Richard had logged into the administrative dashboard over the weekend and manually revoked my employee credentials. He had maliciously locked me out of the agency's central servers. By disabling my remote access, he was attempting to hold years of my hard work hostage. He wanted to block me from retrieving the campaign metrics and client case studies I desperately needed to build my independent portfolio. He was executing a classic corporate squeeze. He expected me to stare at the red error message, realize I possessed zero tangible proof of my professional competence, and experience a total meltdown. He expected me to pick up my phone, call him in a panic, and beg for my job back on whatever terms he dictated. I leaned back on the bar stool and took a slow sip of the dark coffee. I did not panic. I did not pick up my phone to beg. Instead, I reached across the kitchen island and picked up the small silver USB drive I had extracted from Richard's laptop bag during the stone crab ambush on Friday night. I plugged the drive into the side port of my personal laptop. The system recognized the hardware, immediately prompting a secure login window. I typed in a complex, multi-character passphrase that only I knew. The encrypted files unspooled onto my desktop. Richard believed he had locked me out of the castle, but he fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of the building. He was an optics man. He understood networking golf course handshakes and client dinners. He did not understand code data security or back-end server administration. Because I handled all the technical logistics for Parker Media, I had personally engineered the security protocols. The silver USB drive contained the master encryption keys for the entire agency database. When Richard revoked my basic employee portal access, he essentially changed the lock on the front gate. But the USB drive gave me direct encrypted backdoor access to the cloud servers where all the data was physically housed. I was not locked out. I had simply taken the master keys with me. I bypassed the disabled employee portal entirely. Using the encryption keys, I accessed the cloud storage and initiated a secure direct download. Within 15 minutes, every campaign history, every client pitch deck, and every return on investment spreadsheet I had ever authored was safely copied onto my personal hard drive. I had my portfolio. I had the proof of my competence. I ejected the USB drive and set it back on the counter. The immediate technical crisis was averted. I had successfully countered my father's aggressive lockout attempt without engaging in a single argument. But as the download progress bar hit 100%, a new, far more terrifying reality settled over me. Having my data was not the same thing as having an income. I closed the laptop and stood up the cramped walls of my apartment, suddenly feeling suffocating. I began to pace the short distance between the kitchen island and the living room sofa. The severity of the obstacle I was facing materialized in sharp, unforgiving detail. I had no clients. I had no steady paycheck. The severance packages and unemployment benefits that usually accompany a corporate exit did not apply to a spontaneous resignation from a family-owned business. I was completely on my own. The Miami marketing scene is not a supportive, collaborative environment. It is a ruthless, hyper-competitive shark tank. Hundreds of boutique agencies constantly vie for the same luxury real estate developers, hospitality groups, and high-end retail brands. Breaking into that market as an independent consultant requires a massive initial investment of time, capital, and networking clout. My parents held the networking clout. They controlled the relationships with the yacht club members and the local business magnates. I walked over to the sliding glass door and looked out at the bustling city below. Traffic was already gridlocked on Brickell Avenue. People were commuting to jobs that provided health insurance, 401k matches, and direct deposit. I had none of those things. My mind began to spiral, calculating my runway. I had roughly 3 months of living expenses saved in a high-yield account. My rent for the downtown apartment was exorbitant. If I failed to secure a paying client within the next 45 days, I would burn through my emergency fund entirely. I would face eviction long before my independent venture ever got off the ground. The threat of bankruptcy was not a distant theoretical concept. It was a fast-approaching deadline. The bravado I had displayed at the restaurant, the cold satisfaction of walking out on my toxic parents, evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of genuine, visceral terror. I was 31 years old, and I had just deliberately detonated my entire professional safety net. If I failed, my mother's cruel prediction in the parking lot would come true. I would starve, and I would have to crawl back to them and beg for a job, proving to them that I was fundamentally incapable of surviving without their name backing me. I could not let that happen. I needed to secure a client immediately. But the traditional route of cold calling and sending out pitch decks was too slow. It would take weeks to generate leads and months to convert those leads into signed retainers. I needed leverage. I needed a structural advantage that would force the market to take me seriously without relying on my parents' social connections. I walked back to the kitchen island and stared at the silver USB drive resting next to my coffee mug. The master encryption keys were valuable, but they were just a tool to access data. They were not an asset I could monetize. However, the data they protected reminded me of the real weapon I possessed, the very thing my mother had mocked as a little weekend coding hobby. For the past 2 years, I had grown increasingly frustrated by the generic off-the-shelf analytics software Parker Media used to track digital campaign performance. The reporting was sluggish and inaccurate, leading to client dissatisfaction. I had repeatedly pitched the idea of hiring a development team to build a custom proprietary tracking software tailored specifically for our high-end luxury accounts. Richard had laughed at the proposal. He refused to spend the capital on software development, claiming it was an invisible expense that clients would never appreciate. But I knew the back-end infrastructure was the only thing that kept the campaigns profitable. So I built the software myself. I spent my weekends writing the code, testing the algorithms, and integrating the tracking pixels. I successfully deployed the program across all of Parker Media's active accounts. The software drastically improved our metrics, allowing Richard and Valerie to boast about unprecedented return on investment figures to their clients. The agency relied entirely on my custom software to maintain their deliverables. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened my email application. I scrolled back through 2 years of archived messages searching for a specific email thread. My heart hammered against my ribs. If my memory served me correctly, I possessed a legal loophole that would instantly shift the balance of power from my parents to me. I found the email thread dated 18 months prior. I had sent a final formal request to Richard asking the agency to compensate me for the development hours I spent building the analytics software. I opened his reply. The words on the screen were exactly as I remembered them. Arrogant, dismissive, and legally binding. I took a screenshot of the email, my hands finally steady. The terror of unemployment was still present, but it was now partnered with a sharp, tactical focus. I did not need to scramble for small clients. I needed to call a lawyer. The family dispute was over. High-stakes corporate warfare was about to begin. The initial adrenaline rush of discovering the email thread carried me through the rest of the morning, but reading an old message on my laptop was vastly different from executing a legal strategy. I needed a professional to confirm that my interpretation of corporate law was accurate. I spent an hour researching business attorneys in the Miami area who specialized in intellectual property and corporate disputes. By early afternoon, I was sitting in the sleek minimalist conference room of a law firm located on the 30th floor of a high-rise in downtown Miami. The attorney, a sharp, unsmiling woman named Elena, listened quietly as I detailed the events of the weekend. I explained my resignation, the digital lockout attempt, and my subsequent extraction of my personal portfolio using the encryption keys. When I finished, Elena leaned back in her leather chair, tapping a heavy fountain pen against her legal pad. She did not offer false comfort. The legal reality of my situation was harsh and unforgiving. "Your father is going to threaten litigation," Elena stated flatly. "The moment he realizes you bypassed the portal lockout and downloaded files, he will likely have his counsel draft a demand letter. He will accuse you of corporate espionage and theft of company property. Because you were a salaried employee acting as the lead digital strategist, standard work for hire doctrines generally dictate that any data generated during your employment belongs to the agency." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "So I have to return my own portfolio." "You can fight it," Elena replied. "But fighting a corporate data dispute in court requires months of discovery depositions and injunctions. Your parents have the capital to drag the litigation out for years. They will bleed your savings dry in legal retainers before you ever see a courtroom. It is a war of attrition, Bella, and right now they hold the superior financial position." The knot in my stomach twisted into a sharp spike of panic. I was already terrified of burning through my emergency fund trying to launch my independent agency. If Richard tied me up in a costly legal battle over the campaign data, I would be bankrupt by Thanksgiving. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the printed copy of the email thread I had found earlier that morning. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany table toward Elena. What if I have leverage that does not involve the campaign data? I asked, my voice tight. Elena picked up the printout, her eyes scanning the text. What is this? It is an email exchange from 18 months ago, I explained, leaning forward. Parker Media uses a highly specialized proprietary analytics tracking software for all of our high-end luxury accounts. It provides granular conversion metrics that our competitors cannot match. It is the primary selling point Richard uses to secure contracts like the one he was pitching to Marcus at dinner. I paused, pointing to the middle paragraph on the page. But Parker Media did not build that software. I did. I coded the entire program on my own personal laptop during my weekends because the agency desperately needed an upgrade. When I finished, I sent that email to my father, formally requesting that the agency compensate me for the development hours, or at the very least purchase a commercial license to use the program. Elena adjusted her glasses, reading Richard's response aloud. I am not authorizing a payout for unauthorized back-end projects. Elena read her tone neutral, mimicking my father's dismissive corporate cadence. If you want to waste your weekends building this, fine. But Parker Media is not paying for it, and we are not claiming any liability for untested code. Do not submit this on an expense report. Elena lowered the paper, her eyes narrowing as the legal implications of the text settled in the room. I formed an independent LLC last year for my freelance consulting. I continued, the confidence slowly returning to my voice. I registered the intellectual property and the software copyright under that LLC. Richard refused to pay for the development. He explicitly stated in writing that the agency was not claiming liability for the program. He severed his rights to the work. A slow, calculating smile spread across Elena's face. She set the pen down on the legal pad. He did more than sever his rights. Bella, she said, tapping the paper. In corporate intellectual property disputes, the defense usually argues that the employee created the asset using company resources during company time. But your father documented in his own words that you built this on your weekends and that the agency refused to sponsor the project. By explicitly rejecting liability and refusing to purchase a license, he inadvertently confirmed that the software remains your sole intellectual property. The relief washed over me, sharp and intoxicating. The weapon my mother had dismissed as a little weekend coding hobby was actually an armor-plated legal shield. Elena leaned forward, her demeanor shifting from cautious advisor to aggressive litigator. If Parker Media is currently running active client campaigns using software that belongs to your independent LLC, they are committing severe copyright infringement. Every day they continue to use the program without a licensing agreement, they are exposing the agency to massive financial liability. You said they would bleed me dry fighting over the campaign data, I said, matching her aggressive posture. Can we bleed them over the software? We do not even need to go to court yet, Elena replied, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from her pad. We bypass the dispute over the campaign data entirely. We strike directly at their operational infrastructure. We issue a formal cease and desist letter to Parker Media today. We notify them that they are illegally operating proprietary software owned by your LLC, and we legally bar them from utilizing the tracking program for any of their clients effective immediately. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. I did not need to fight for the client list. I controlled the exact mechanism the clients relied upon. Without the analytics software, Richard's promises of granular market data and unprecedented return on investment were entirely hollow. He could not deliver the results he pitched at the yacht clubs. Draft the letter. I instructed, a cold, hard determination settling into my chest. The terrified daughter who had panicked over a dropped clutch was gone. I was a business owner defending her assets. Send it directly to his private email and copy their corporate counsel. Elena nodded, already drafting the framework of the document. The letter will be delivered by 5 o'clock this evening. I need you to be prepared, Bella. When your father receives this, the dynamic will change permanently. This is no longer a messy family dispute over a birthday dinner. You are initiating high-stakes corporate warfare. They will retaliate. I know, I said, standing up from the heavy leather chair. I survived my childhood. I can survive a corporate retaliation. I left the law office and stepped back out into the sweltering Miami afternoon. The anxiety that had paralyzed me that morning was completely gone. The legal boundary was established. I had effectively severed the agency's access to their most valuable operational tool. I had thrown the first punch in a war they thought I was too weak to fight. But Elena's warning echoed in my mind as I rode the train back to my apartment in Brickell. They will retaliate. I knew my parents. I knew how they operated when cornered. Richard and Valerie did not possess the technical skills to fix the back-end software issue themselves, and they were far too cheap to hire an outside development firm to build a replacement on short notice. They would not respond to the cease and desist letter with a polite negotiation or a licensing offer. They would respond with an aggressive, calculated attack designed to destroy my credibility before I could secure any independent clients. They could not attack my software, so they were going to attack my reputation. The realization hit me with a sickening certainty. They were going to weaponize the insular, gossip-driven world of South Florida high society to ensure that no one in Miami would ever hire me. The battle over the intellectual property was secured, but the fight for my professional survival was about to enter a vicious, deeply personal phase that would test my endurance and isolate me entirely. The cease and desist letter hit Richard's inbox at exactly 4:45 on Monday afternoon. I did not receive an angry phone call or a frantic text message in response. The silence from my parents was immediate and absolute. It was the specific, calculated silence of a corporate entity pivoting into damage control. By Wednesday, the operational impact of the software blackout became undeniable. Without the proprietary analytics program, Parker Media was flying blind. The automated client reporting dashboards I had built ceased functioning. The granular conversion metrics Richard relied upon to justify his exorbitant retainer fees vanished overnight. Valerie and Richard were forced to manually compile data using generic off-the-shelf spreadsheets, a tedious process that exposed the severe gaps in their technical knowledge. They were bleeding efficiency, and their clients accustomed to high-end real-time data tracking began asking pointed questions. My parents needed a scapegoat to cover their incompetence. They needed a narrative that explained the sudden drop in agency performance while simultaneously appeasing Marcus's wealthy father, who was undoubtedly wondering why the promising young digital strategist had abruptly fled a stone crab dinner. Their retaliation was not legal. It was personal, vicious, and incredibly effective. The South Florida business community, particularly the luxury sectors operating within Coral Gables and Palm Beach, is a notoriously insular ecosystem. It runs on country club memberships, charity gala sponsorships, and whispered conversations over expensive cocktails. It is a world where reputation is a currency far more valuable than actual competence. Richard and Valerie weaponized that network with lethal precision. The rumors began filtering back to me by the second week of my independence. I had spent the weekend drafting proposals for local tech startups, eager to secure my first solo contracts. I attended a midday networking luncheon in the Brickell Financial District, armed with business cards and a polished pitch deck. I approached the founder of a promising boutique hospitality brand. We had exchanged warm emails previously, and she had expressed strong interest in utilizing my tracking software for her upcoming hotel launches. As I offered my hand, her expression shifted. The warm, professional courtesy vanished, replaced by a tight, cautious politeness. She did not take my business card. "Bella, it is nice to see you," she said, her tone guarded. "I actually spoke with your mother at the yacht club benefit on Saturday evening. She mentioned you were stepping away from the industry for a while to focus on your health." The blood drained from my face. "Focus on my health. I am launching an independent consultancy," I clarified, keeping my voice level despite the sudden spike of adrenaline in my chest. I left Parker Media to expand my software licensing. The founder offered a sympathetic, deeply uncomfortable smile. "Valerie said you were struggling with the pressure. She mentioned you had a bit of a breakdown at a client dinner and required some time off to stabilize. We decided to go in a different direction for our marketing rollout. We really need someone reliable to handle the launch. I wish you the best in your recovery, Bella." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone near the catering table. The true nature of this retaliation crystallized in my mind. My parents were not just telling people I resigned. They were actively constructing a narrative of mental instability. They were telling the wealthy elite of Miami that I was erratic, unreliable, and emotionally broken. It was a masterful, devastating lie. It provided a convenient excuse for the sudden drop in Parker Media's performance, blaming the chaos on a sudden employee breakdown rather than a software injunction, and it effectively neutralized me as a competitor before I could even enter the market. Who wants to hire a digital strategist who cannot handle her own emotions at a dinner table? The smear campaign spread rapidly. I lost a second critical contract later that same week. A mid-size e-commerce brand backed out of a finalized agreement citing concerns over my professional stability. They had heard through the grapevine that I was fired for erratic behavior. The financial reality of the sabotage was terrifying. The high-yield savings account I was relying on to cover my downtown apartment rent was draining faster than I anticipated. The legal retainer I paid Elena to manage the software copyright had eaten a significant portion of my emergency fund. I was working 14-hour days fueled by cheap Cuban espresso from the corner bodega, sending out dozens of pitch emails that were met with deafening silence. The isolation was crushing. I was entirely cut off from the professional network I had spent a decade building, ostracized by the very people I used to manage campaigns for. Has a family member ever spread a lie about you to protect their own reputation? How did you handle the fallout? Did you fight the rumor, or did you walk away and clear your name elsewhere? Drop your story in the comments below, because watching my parents actively destroy my livelihood almost broke my resolve entirely. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was sitting on the floor of my small apartment, surrounded by stacks of unpaid invoices and rejected proposal drafts. The air conditioning unit hummed loudly, failing to cut through the oppressive Miami humidity seeping through the windows. I was exhausted, underfed, and drowning in administrative fatigue. I reached for a stack of old files to clear space on the rug. My hand brushed against a framed photograph I had packed away in a box months ago and forgotten about. It was a picture taken at a charity gala 3 years prior. Richard and Valerie were smiling brightly at the camera, wearing expensive formal wear. I was standing slightly behind them, partially obscured by my father's shoulder, wearing a simple black dress. I stared at the photograph, the weight of the past 3 weeks crashing down on me. They did not care if I starved. They did not care if I lost my apartment. They were willing to permanently ruin my professional reputation, labeling me as mentally unstable to their wealthy friends, just to cover up their own incompetence and protect their retirement plans. They valued the approval of Marcus's real estate developer father more than they valued my survival. The anger I had carried since the birthday dinner finally gave way to a profound, devastating heartbreak. I picked up the framed photograph. My hands shook violently. I did not deliver a stoic, empowering speech to the empty room. I hurled the frame across the apartment. It struck the side of the metal trash bin and shattered. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed off the bare walls, followed by the dull thud of the wooden frame hitting the floorboards. I collapsed onto the rug, pulling my knees to my chest. I sobbed, the sound tearing out of my throat, raw and ragged. I cried for the mother who prioritized networking over nurturing. I cried for the father who locked me out of the servers I built. I cried for the terrifying, lonely reality of trying to build a business in a city that had been poisoned against me. The messy, unpolished emotional breakdown lasted for an hour. I allowed myself to feel the full, suffocating weight of the betrayal. I did not try to fix it. I just sat in the wreckage of the shattered glass and mourned the complete loss of my family. But as the storm of tears eventually subsided, leaving me hollow and exhausted, the practical reality of my situation remained unchanged. Crying on the floor did not pay the rent. Smashing a photograph did not secure a client contract. I forced myself to stand up. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a broom, and methodically swept up the broken glass, dumping the shards into the trash bin. I took the photograph of my parents, tore it neatly down the middle, and threw it away. I walked back to my computer. The smear campaign was a brutal obstacle, but it was not insurmountable. I could not fight the rumors at the yacht clubs or the country club dinners. I did not possess the social capital to change the narrative in those spaces. I needed to bypass the Miami elite entirely. I needed to pivot my strategy and target independent, out-of-state businesses that did not care about South Florida gossip. I needed clients who only cared about hard data and proprietary tracking metrics. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began compiling a new target list. The exhaustion was still heavy in my bones, but the despair was gone. I was relying entirely on my own grit and competence. Reclaiming my life was not going to happen through a dramatic confrontation or a viral social media post. It was going to require immense, boring, grueling endurance. I typed until the sun began to rise over the Atlantic Ocean, casting a pale gray light into my apartment. I was prepared to spend the next 6 months fighting tooth and nail for every single dollar. I was prepared for the slow, agonizing grind of entrepreneurship. What I was not prepared for was the sudden, violent intervention of nature. While I was building my new client list, ignoring the local news channels, a massive weather system was forming off the coast of the Bahamas. The tropical depression had rapidly intensified, feeding off the unseasonably warm waters of the Caribbean. By the time I finally closed my laptop and checked my phone for weather updates, the alerts were already flashing red across the screen. A late-season hurricane was tracking directly toward the South Florida coastline, threatening to shut down the entire city grid. The storm was not just an atmospheric event. It was about to act as a catastrophic catalyst, plunging Miami into darkness and forcing my father to make a desperate illegal mistake that would escalate our corporate warfare into highly dangerous territory. The skies over Miami transformed from a vibrant tropical blue to a bruised, sickly purple within 48 hours. The local meteorologists on the morning broadcasts abandoned their usual cheerful banter. The late-season tropical depression, churning over the warm waters of the Atlantic, had rapidly intensified, upgrading to a Category 2 hurricane. The projected cone of uncertainty placed the eye of the storm tracking directly toward the South Florida coastline, with landfall expected by late Thursday evening. The entire city shifted into immediate frantic preparation mode. The grocery store shelves were stripped of bottled water and non-perishable food within hours. Plywood vanished from the hardware stores. The gas stations along U.S. Route 1 were jammed with long lines of cars, waiting to fill their tanks and extra fuel cans. I spent Wednesday afternoon preparing my small apartment in Brickell. The physical labor was exhausting in the stifling, oppressive humidity that always precedes a major storm. I dragged my heavy patio furniture inside from the balcony, stacking the metal chairs in the center of my living room to prevent them from becoming airborne projectiles. I taped the edges of my sliding glass doors, filled my bathtub with water for emergency sanitation, and organized my flashlights and battery banks on the kitchen counter. I executed the preparations entirely alone. The physical exertion mirrored the deep, hollow isolation I felt. In previous years, hurricane prep was a coordinated family effort. I would drive to my parents' spacious home in Coral Gables to help Richard install the heavy accordion storm shutters while Valerie inventoried the pantry. We would ride out the severe weather together, playing board games in their fortified living room while the wind howled outside. This time, my phone remained silent. There were no text messages asking if I had enough supplies. There were no calls offering a safe place to stay if my building lost power. My parents were likely securing their own property, completely unconcerned about whether their daughter was safe in a high-rise apartment located in an evacuation zone. They were prioritizing their reputation and their business survival over my physical safety. By Thursday afternoon, the outer bands of the hurricane began lashing the city. The rain blew sideways, slamming against the glass windows of my apartment with the force of a pressure washer. The wind shrieked through the concrete canyons of the downtown district, a constant, terrifying roar that rattled the walls. I sat on the floor of my living room, leaning my back against the kitchen island, watching the storm rage outside. The sky grew incredibly dark, turning day into night. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the lights in my apartment flickered twice and died. The power grid failed. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the eerie, ambient glow of emergency exit signs in the hallway outside my door. The hum of the refrigerator and the air conditioning unit ceased, leaving the shrieking wind as the only sound in the building. I clicked on a heavy-duty LED flashlight, setting it on the counter to cast a pool of white light across the room. I sat in the dark, the temperature inside the apartment rising steadily without the air conditioning. The isolation pressed down on me heavy and suffocating. The fierce, uncompromising independence I had cultivated over the past month felt fragile in the face of the storm. I questioned every decision I had made since the birthday dinner. Was launching the corporate warfare worth this level of profound loneliness? Was the legal battle over the software worth sitting alone in the dark, missing the parents I desperately wished I had, while knowing I could never return to the parents I actually possessed? It was a messy, vulnerable moment. I was not a fearless, unshakable entrepreneur. I was a young woman sitting on the floor, shivering, despite the heat, mourning the reality of a fractured family during a natural disaster. But while I was navigating my emotional isolation in the dark, the hurricane was acting as a catastrophic catalyst across town, accelerating a major crisis inside the offices of Parker Media. The severe weather did not just knock out the residential power grids. The torrential rain and high winds caused widespread localized flooding and infrastructure damage. Several miles away, the secondary data center that hosted the regional servers for a major Parker Media client, a prominent Miami hospitality group, experienced a critical hardware failure due to a power surge. The client server crashed. Under normal circumstances, this type of localized outage was a manageable issue. When I was the lead digital strategist, I had designed a robust failover protocol using my proprietary analytics software. If a primary server went down, my program would automatically reroute the active digital campaigns to a cloud-based backup, ensuring the client's advertising metrics continued tracking without interruption. But Richard and Valerie did not have access to my software. The cease and desist letter drafted by my attorney legally barred them from operating the program. Even if they had ignored the legal warning, they physically could not run the failover protocol. I possessed the master encryption keys on the silver USB drive currently resting in my purse. Richard was trapped. The hospitality client was currently spending tens of thousands of dollars on a targeted digital ad spend that was now firing into a dead server. The campaign metrics were lost. The return on investment data was vaporizing in real time. If Richard could not restore the tracking within a few hours, the client would demand a massive refund and likely terminate their contract entirely. Parker Media was already bleeding clients due to the sudden drop in performance. Losing the hospitality group would push the agency toward bankruptcy. Panic makes people reckless. Richard, sitting in his fortified house in Coral Gables running his laptop off a gasoline generator, decided he could not afford to wait out the storm. He could not afford to lose the contract. He opened the agency administrative portal. He attempted to manually bypass the encryption protocols I had established, hoping to force the system to run the automated failover sequence without the master keys. He tried to override the security certificates, treating the complex back-end infrastructure like a jammed lock he could simply force open with enough pressure. He made a critical, illegal mistake. The proprietary software I built was not just a tracking tool. It was a highly secure, closed-loop system designed to protect sensitive client data from external hacking attempts. When Richard repeatedly attempted to bypass the encryption without the correct authorization keys, the software registered his actions as a hostile, unauthorized intrusion. The system engaged its final, unyielding defensive measure. Sitting in my dark apartment, my cell phone vibrated on the floor next to me. I picked it up. Despite the power outage, the cellular networks were still functioning intermittently. The screen displayed an automated SMS alert generated by the LLC server hosting my software. Critical alert. Multiple unauthorized access attempts detected. IP address logged. System lockdown initiated. I stared at the glowing screen, the text illuminating my face in the dark room. Richard had tried to hack his way into my software. He had attempted to illegally breach the intellectual property I owned to save his failing client campaign. The automated security protocol did not just deny his access. It locked the entire Parker Media database down. Every single active campaign, every client portal, and every internal tracking metric tied to the agency was frozen encrypted behind a firewall that required a manual reset from the software administrator. Me. The hurricane was not just an atmospheric event. The intense pressure of the storm had forced my father into a corner, pushing him to abandon his calculated corporate maneuvering in favor of desperate illegal action. He had tried to steal his way out of the crisis, and in doing so, he had handed me irrefutable digital proof of his unauthorized access attempt. He had not just violated the cease and desist order, he had violated federal data security laws. I set the phone down next to the flashlight. The vulnerability and loneliness I had felt minutes ago vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The storm raging outside my windows was violent, but it was nothing compared to the corporate devastation Richard had just brought upon his own agency. He had handed me the exact leverage I needed to end the war he started. I leaned my head back against the kitchen island, listening to the wind shriek against the glass. The power grid would eventually be restored. The floodwaters would recede. But the damage Richard had just inflicted on Parker Media was permanent, and when the sun rose the next morning, the desperation he felt trying to bypass those servers was going to walk right up to my front door. The hurricane moved rapidly across the Florida peninsula, dragging its destructive winds and torrential rains out into the Gulf of Mexico by the early hours of Friday morning. When the sun finally rose over Miami, the sky was a bruised, pale gray, casting a harsh light over the aftermath of the storm. The city was remarkably quiet, stripped of its usual chaotic traffic and construction noise. I unlocked the sliding glass door of my apartment and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was thick and stagnant, heavily scented with shredded pine needles and stagnant salt water. The streets below in Brickell were littered with debris. Massive green palm fronds blocked the intersections, and shallow, muddy floodwaters pooled along the curbs. Sirens wailed in the distance, a stark reminder of the cleanup efforts already underway. The power in my building had flickered back to life around 4 a.m. My refrigerator was humming, and the air conditioning was slowly cutting through the oppressive humidity inside the apartment. The physical storm had passed, but the digital lockdown I had witnessed on my phone the previous night loomed large in my mind. Richard's desperate, illegal attempt to breach my software had entirely paralyzed Parker Media. The agency was effectively dead in the water until I manually reset the servers. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, expecting my phone to ring at any moment. I anticipated an angry, threatening call from Richard, demanding I reverse the lockdown. I expected corporate posturing. I did not expect the sharp, frantic knock on my front door. I walked across the living room and checked the peephole. My heart hammered against my ribs. Standing in the hallway, looking small and uncharacteristically disheveled, was my mother, Valerie. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. She had not reached out to me during the hurricane. She had spent the last several weeks spreading vicious rumors about my mental health to her wealthy friends at the yacht club. Letting her inside felt dangerous, but the sheer desperation radiating from her posture convinced me to turn the lock. I pulled the door open. Valerie stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. She was carrying a heavy plastic grocery bag. She walked straight into the kitchen and dropped the bag onto the granite island. It landed with a dull thud. Cans of soup, bottled water, and a few battery-powered lanterns spilled out onto the counter. She turned to face me, and the sight of her stripped away any lingering anger I held, replacing it with a profound, uncomfortable shock. The immaculate, polished facade she maintained for the Miami social elite was completely shattered. Valerie looked exhausted. The thick humidity had ruined her usually perfect salon-styled hair, leaving it frizzy and plastered to her neck. She was wearing an old, wrinkled tracksuit instead of her tailored designer clothes. Deep, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. She looked like a woman who had spent the entire night pacing the floor, staring into the abyss. "I brought supplies," Valerie said, her voice raspy and thin. "I did not know if your building lost power. I wanted to make sure you had enough water." I stared at the scattered cans of soup. It was a pathetic, transparent olive branch. She had driven through flooded streets and debris-blocked intersections the morning after a hurricane to bring me canned goods I did not need. We both knew she was not there out of maternal concern. "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "The power came back on a few hours ago. I am fine." Valerie gripped the edge of the kitchen island, her knuckles turning white. She did not attempt to engage in small talk. The corporate crisis was too severe for pleasantries. "We are losing everything, Bella." She confessed, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a chaotic rush. "The agency is hemorrhaging clients. Since you issued the cease and desist, we have not been able to deliver accurate reporting. The hospitality group canceled their contract this morning. They lost thousands of dollars in ad spend yesterday because their server crashed during the storm, and your father could not fix the routing." She paused, swallowing hard. Her eyes filled with tears, genuine and terrified. When Richard tried to access the back end last night, he tripped the security protocol. The entire agency database locked down. "We cannot access any client files. We cannot even run the payroll software. We are completely paralyzed. If we cannot get the system back online today, we will have to file for bankruptcy by the end of the month. I listened to her panic, my posture remaining rigid. He tried to illegally bypass the encryption keys on software. He does not own Mom. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected the data from an unauthorized intrusion. Valerie ignored the legal reality of my statement. She rounded the kitchen island, closing the distance between us. She reached out and grabbed both of my hands. Her palms were cold and clammy. "Please, Bella," she begged, tears spilling over her lower lashes. "Lift the cease and desist. Reset the servers. I am asking you as your mother. I am begging you to help us." The vulnerability in her eyes was startling. I had rarely seen her drop the armor of her arrogance. She was not delivering a calculated pitch. She was exposing a raw, unhealed nerve. "You do not understand what is at stake here," Valerie continued, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. "If the agency fails, we lose the house in Coral Gables. We lose the retirement accounts. I am terrified, Bella. I cannot go back to having nothing. I cannot go back to living in a trailer and swatting mosquitoes in the dark. I spent my entire life climbing out of that swamp. I cannot survive falling back into it." The plea struck me right in the chest. I felt a deep, powerful surge of empathy for the terrified woman standing in front of me. The trauma of her impoverished childhood was genuine. She had built her entire identity around escaping the destitution she experienced near the Everglades. The thought of losing her wealth, her status, and her security was pushing her toward a mental breaking point. For a brief, dangerous second, the lifelong conditioning kicked in. I felt the overwhelming urge to comfort her. I wanted to hug her, tell her everything was going to be all right, and log into my laptop to reset the servers. I wanted to be the good daughter who fixed the problem and restored the peace. But as I looked down at her hands gripping mine, the reality of our situation crystallized. Valerie was crying, but she was not apologizing. She had not mentioned the humiliating birthday dinner at the Coconut Grove restaurant. She had not expressed a single ounce of remorse for seating me across from Marcus and his new girlfriend. She had not apologized for the vicious smear campaign she launched at the yacht clubs, telling her wealthy friends that I was mentally unstable. She did not care that she had actively tried to destroy my professional reputation and my livelihood. She was only crying because the consequences of her actions had finally impacted her bank account. She was terrified of poverty, but she had been perfectly willing to push me into financial ruin if it meant maintaining her own leverage. She was using her trauma to manipulate my empathy. She wanted me to feel sorry for her, so I would surrender the only protection I had. I pulled my hands gently but firmly out of her grip. I stepped back, creating a physical boundary between us. "I am sorry you are scared, Mom," I said softly, the empathy still present in my voice, but tempered by a cold, unyielding resolve. "I know how much you fear losing what you have built, but I cannot save you from the consequences of Richard's actions. He tried to hack my software. He committed a federal data breach." "We are your family," Valerie argued, her tone hardening as she realized the tears were not working. "Family is supposed to protect each other from ruin. You cannot just stand there and watch us lose everything over a petty disagreement." "It is not a petty disagreement," I corrected, my voice gaining strength. "You ambushed me. You tried to sell my dignity for a real estate contract. When I established a boundary, you tried to destroy my career. You told the entire South Florida business community that I had a mental breakdown. You tried to ensure that I would fail and starve just like you promised I would in the restaurant parking lot." Valerie's eyes widened, the realization hitting her that I knew exactly what she had been whispering behind closed doors. She opened her mouth to mount a defense, but I cut her off. "If I reset those servers and lift the cease and desist, I am giving you permission to keep treating me like a disposable asset," I stated clearly. "If I give in now, I am just sitting back down at the table with the stone crabs. I am not doing it, Mom. The software belongs to my LLC. The lockdown remains active." The fragile maternal vulnerability vanished instantly. The terrifyingly cold, pragmatic businesswoman returned. Valerie straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her wrinkled tracksuit. The tears stopped flowing. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a hostile corporate adversary who had just rejected a merger. "You think you are being principled?" Valerie sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "But you are just being naive. You think you can survive in this city without us. You think that little software program makes you untouchable. We built Parker Media from nothing. We know how to leverage assets. We are not going to let a stubborn, ungrateful child dismantle our retirement." She turned away from me, grabbed the plastic grocery bag she had brought the supplies in, and walked toward the front door. She did not say goodbye. She did not tell me to stay safe after the storm. She simply walked out the heavy apartment door, clicking shut behind her. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the scattered cans of soup on the granite counter. The emotional encounter had drained me entirely. I had successfully held the boundary, but the cost was devastating. I had looked my mother in the eyes and refused to save her from financial ruin. But as the silence settled over the apartment, a new sharp anxiety began to gnaw at the back of my mind. Valerie had left the apartment angry, but she had also left with a chilling confidence. She claimed they knew how to leverage assets. She warned me that they were not going to let me dismantle their retirement. My parents were cornered, bleeding clients and locked out of their own database. They were desperate, and desperate people do not surrender quietly. Valerie had not come to my apartment just to beg for mercy. She had come to gauge my resolve. When she realized I was not going to fold, she immediately pivoted to a new strategy. I knew with absolute certainty that they were about to launch a massive, highly calculated offensive designed to force my hand, and the opening move of that offensive was going to arrive in the form of a horrific, morally bankrupt ultimatum that would force me to choose between my intellectual property and my professional survival. The oppressive silence of my apartment following Valerie's departure was short-lived. I had anticipated retaliation, but I had not anticipated the sheer audacity of the tactic my parents chose to employ. They did not wait for the legal machinery of the cease and desist to force a formal mediation. They bypassed my attorney entirely. Less than 4 hours after Valerie walked out of my door, leaving the scattered cans of hurricane soup behind a courier arrived. The courier handed me a sleek, heavy stock envelope bearing the Parker Media letterhead. I signed for it, the paper feeling unnaturally cold against my fingers. I set the envelope on my kitchen island, right next to the silver USB drive containing the master encryption keys. I did not open it immediately. I knew what was inside. It was not an apology. It was a transaction. When I finally broke the seal, I pulled out a multi-page legal document printed on crisp white paper. It was a formal contract drafted by my father's corporate counsel. Attached to the front was a handwritten note from Valerie. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and precise, a stark contrast to the tearful, disheveled woman who had begged for my help that morning. The note read, "Review this carefully. It is the only lifeline we are offering. We can put this ugly misunderstanding behind us and secure the future for everyone." I set the note aside and began reading the contract. The legal jargon was dense, but the core proposition was clear, concrete, and deeply horrific. Richard and Valerie were offering me a 10% equity stake in Parker Media. They were offering to promote me from an employee to a minority partner, granting me a fractional share of the agency's profits and a seat at the executive table. But the equity was not a gift. It was a purchase price, and the conditions attached to the offer were suffocating. Clause 1 required me to immediately lift the cease and desist order and manually reset the servers I had locked down during the hurricane. Clause 2 demanded that I permanently transfer the intellectual property rights and the copyright of my proprietary analytics software from my independent LLC to Parker Media. I would surrender total ownership of the asset I had built. But it was Clause 3 that made my stomach churn and a bitter taste of bile rise in my throat. Clause 3 stipulated that as a newly minted executive partner, I would be required to personally manage the luxury real estate portfolio for Marcus's father. To secure the account, the contract explicitly required me to draft a formal letter of apology to Marcus and his family, taking full responsibility for the misunderstanding at the Coconut Grove birthday dinner and assuring them of my professional stability. They were demanding that I publicly humiliate myself. They wanted me to grovel to the man who broke my heart and apologize for reacting poorly to their ambush. They needed me to repair the social damage they had caused so they could secure the massive Snowbird developer contract. Valerie had pitched this in her note as a lifeline. She saw it as a brilliant, pragmatic compromise. In her mind, she was offering me a pathway to wealth and executive power. She believed that a 10% equity stake was more than enough compensation to wipe away the emotional abuse, the smear campaign, and the theft of my intellectual property. I sat on the bar stool, staring at the contract, feeling a wave of intense physical sickness wash over me. The offer proved with devastating clarity that nothing had changed. The tears Valerie had shed that morning were authentic regarding her fear of poverty, but they contained zero genuine remorse for her actions. My parents still viewed me exactly as they had at the birthday dinner. I was a prop. I was a tool to be leveraged. They were attempting to purchase my compliance because they could no longer command it for free. They were asking me to sell my dignity. They were demanding the legal rights to my hard work. They wanted me to erase the boundaries I had fought so desperately to establish, all in exchange for a minority stake in a toxic, failing company run by people who had actively tried to destroy my reputation just a week prior. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Valerie. "Did you read it? It is a win-win, Bella. We save the agency and you secure your financial future." I picked up the phone. I did not text back. I dialed her number directly. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anticipation. "Bella, have you reviewed the terms? I read it," I said. My voice shook, not with the panic that had crippled me at the restaurant, but with a cold, absolute clarity. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable certainty. "Good, Valerie," replied, her tone shifting into her smooth negotiating register. "Richard has the notary ready. If you bring the USB drive to the house this afternoon, we can finalize the transfer, get the servers back online, and send the apology letter to Marcus's father before the end of the business day. We can salvage the real estate account." "I am not signing the contract, Mom," I stated, the words cutting through her corporate planning like a scalpel. The line went silent for 3 long seconds. "Excuse me," Valerie asked, the warmth instantly vanishing from her voice. "I am not signing it." I repeated, my grip tightening on the phone. "I am not lifting the cease and desist. I am not transferring my intellectual property to Parker Media. And I am absolutely not writing an apology letter to Marcus or his family for a situation you orchestrated." "You are being irrational." Valerie snapped, the familiar patronizing edge returning. 10% equity in an established agency is a massive opportunity. You are currently unemployed, Bella. You have no clients. You are sitting in an apartment you will not be able to afford in 2 months. We are offering you a partnership. "You are offering me a collar," I argued back, my chest heaving as the anger finally surfaced. "You are asking me to sell my soul for 10% of a company you are currently driving into bankruptcy. You want me to grovel to the man who broke my heart so you can fund your retirement in the Keys. You think money excuses the fact that you told everyone at the yacht club I was mentally unstable. I did what I had to do to protect the business when you abandoned us." Valerie defended, her voice rising in pitch. "You left us with no choice, but we are willing to overlook your erratic behavior if you sign the paperwork. We are offering you a clean slate." "There is no clean slate," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You do not get to smear my name across South Florida and then try to buy my software at a discount. 10% equity is not enough to buy my dignity, Mom. 50% is not enough. There is no number on earth that makes this acceptable. If you reject this offer, you are rejecting your family entirely." Valerie threatened, deploying the ultimate emotional weapon. "You are choosing to bankrupt your father and me over a petty grudge. If you do this, do not ever call us again. We will not help you when your little independent venture fails. You will be completely on your own." "I have always been on my own," I replied, the truth of the statement settling deep into my bones. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise. I ended the call. I did not wait for her to respond. I took the multi-page legal contract, tore it neatly down the middle, and dropped the pieces into the trash bin beneath my kitchen sink. The dark bargain was rejected. The bridge was not just burned, the ashes had been scattered into the ocean. I had officially severed my relationship with my parents. I had refused their lifeline, choosing instead to plunge myself into the terrifying, uncharted waters of independent entrepreneurship. The emotional victory of refusing the ultimatum was powerful, but it offered zero practical protection against the brutal reality of my financial situation. I had protected my intellectual property, but my bank account was still draining. I had drawn the line, but now I had to survive the consequences of my own independence. I had to build a business from scratch, in a city where my parents had actively poisoned the well. The corporate warfare was shifting from a legal standoff to a grueling, exhausting marathon of survival, and the next few months were going to demand a level of endurance I was not entirely sure I possessed. Rejecting a toxic ultimatum delivers a temporary high, but pride does not cover the cost of Miami rent. The morning after I dropped my parents' contract into the trash bin, the reality of my independence set in. There was no safety net waiting to catch me. I had severed my ties with the only professional network I knew, and the corporate sabotage my parents engineered was still actively poisoning the high-end market against me. I needed to build a new agency from the ground up, and I needed to do it before my savings account hit zero. I could not afford a sleek office in Coral Gables or a high-rise suite in the financial district. I signed a month-to-month lease for a single cramped desk in a loud co-working space located in the Wynwood Arts District. The neighborhood was famous for its vibrant street murals and warehouse galleries, but the workspace itself was purely functional. I sat elbow to elbow with freelance graphic designers and tech startup founders. The air always smelled of cheap printer ink and the strong, sugary aroma of Cuban espresso brewing in the communal kitchen. The concrete floors echoed with the constant hum of overlapping conversations and ringing phones. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the quiet, marble-lined corridors of Parker Media. The transition was painful. My days no longer involved business lunches at waterfront restaurants. They involved waking up at 5 in the morning, brewing a pot of strong Café Cubano, and sitting at my small desk for 14 hours straight. I was the chief executive, the lead strategist, and the janitor of my own life. The early weeks were an exercise in brutal, unglamorous rejection. I attempted to secure contracts with mid-tier retail brands across South Florida, sending out dozens of carefully crafted pitch decks, showcasing the capabilities of my proprietary analytics software. Most of my emails went unanswered. The few business owners who did reply often canceled our introductory meetings at the last minute. The smear campaign my parents launched was still circulating through the local industry. Richard and Valerie had convinced the market that I was unstable and unreliable. I was fighting a phantom enemy, losing deals to rumors I could not confront in person. The financial strain began to suffocate me. My attorney Elena worked diligently to solidify the copyright protections for my software and enforce the cease and desist against my parents. But legal representation is exorbitantly expensive. Every time an invoice from her firm hit my inbox, my stomach tied itself into a knot. I watched my emergency fund dwindle, transferring funds from my savings to cover my apartment rent and my legal retainers. There were nights when I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of profound doubt. The darkness amplified my fears. I wondered if my mother was right in the parking lot. I wondered if I was too naive to survive in this city alone. The temptation to pick up the phone call my father and accept the 10% equity offer whispered in the back of my mind. It would have been so easy to surrender, sign the apology letter to Marcus, and let the financial terror end. But every time that thought surfaced, I remembered the stone crab dinner. I remembered the smug, calculating look on Valerie's face as she dismissed my hard work as a hobby. I remembered that returning to Parker Media meant accepting a life where my dignity was always up for sale. The fear of bankruptcy was terrifying, but the fear of losing my soul was stronger. I forced myself out of bed every morning and returned to the loud, cramped desk in Wynwood. I realized that trying to compete in the luxury sector was a losing battle as long as my parents controlled the narrative at the country clubs. I needed to pivot my strategy. I needed to target clients who operated far outside the yacht club ecosystem. I shifted my focus to the working-class backbone of South Florida. I started cold calling independent mechanics in Hialeah family, owned commercial plumbing companies in Broward County, and local craft breweries opening up in industrial parks. These were business owners who wore work boots instead of linen suits. They did not attend charity galas, and they did not care about the gossip circulating among the Palm Beach elite. They only cared about one thing: return on investment. The process of securing these clients was grueling. I drove my small sedan across the sprawling flat highways of the state, sitting in dusty break rooms and warehouse offices, giving live demonstrations of my analytics software. I showed them exactly how my program could track a customer, clicking an online advertisement, all the way through to booking a service appointment. I showed them hard, undeniable data. My first breakthrough came during a meeting with the owner of a mid-size roofing company. He was a pragmatic, no-nonsense man who had spent 20 years building his business. He listened quietly as I explained the granular conversion metrics my software offered. He did not ask about my departure from Parker Media. He did not ask if I was emotionally stable. He looked at the dashboard on my laptop, saw the efficiency of the code I had written, and signed a modest monthly retainer contract right there on the hood of his truck. That first independent check did not feature a comma, but holding it in my hands felt like holding a winning lottery ticket. It was proof of concept. It was tangible evidence that I could generate revenue using nothing but my own intellect and the software I had built from scratch. The momentum shifted slowly. There was no cinematic montage of instant success accompanied by an upbeat soundtrack. There was only the slow, grinding endurance of answering emails, adjusting algorithms, and earning trust one small business at a time. I signed a commercial landscaping firm, then a regional logistics company. I was not securing the flashy, high-profile accounts that generated industry headlines, but I was building a solid, reliable foundation of recurring revenue. The income stabilized my bank account. I paid Elena's legal retainers on time. I paid my downtown rent without dipping into my dwindling savings. The crushing existential dread of impending poverty began to recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce pride. I was doing exactly what Valerie had promised I could never do. I was surviving without the Parker name backing me. My proprietary software was the engine driving my survival. As I deployed the program across my new roster of clients, the tracking algorithms refined themselves, becoming even more efficient. The independent businesses I contracted with began seeing significant spikes in their customer acquisition rates. They started recommending my services to other vendors within their trade networks. My agency was no longer just a desperate attempt to stay afloat. It was a functioning, profitable entity gaining real traction in the local market. Success in the corporate world rarely goes unnoticed, especially when a piece of highly effective technology is involved. I had successfully bypassed my parents' social circle to build my client list, but the sheer efficiency of my analytics software was beginning to generate its own kind of reputation. Data speaks louder than country club rumors, and the metrics my clients were achieving started drawing the attention of much larger predators in the South Florida business ecosystem. The quiet, exhausting grind of my independence was about to be interrupted. I spent 6 months fighting for every single dollar, guarding my intellectual property with fierce determination. I proved I could survive the starvation tactics my parents employed. But the next threat I faced would not come in the form of a lockout or a smear campaign. It would come disguised as a golden parachute, a highly lucrative offer from a powerful rival firm that would test my vigilance and force me to decide exactly how much my independence was truly worth. 6 months after I walked out of the Coconut Grove restaurant and left $300 on the table, the humid Miami air began to signal the arrival of spring. My life had settled into a rigorous, predictable rhythm. I had successfully transitioned my business out of the loud, cramped co-working space in Wynwood and signed a lease for a small private office suite in a commercial building near the airport. It was not glamorous, but it was quiet, and more importantly, it belonged entirely to me. The proprietary analytics software I had spent my weekends coding was no longer a hidden asset. It was actively driving the growth of my independent agency. The regional plumbing companies, roofing contractors, and local breweries I represented were seeing unprecedented conversion rates. In the digital marketing industry, word of highly effective tracking tools spreads rapidly. Advertising firms are constantly searching for any technological edge that can justify their retainer fees to skeptical clients. It was only a matter of time before a larger fish in the South Florida corporate pond noticed the wake my software was creating. On a bright Tuesday morning, I received an email from the executive director of a prominent advertising firm based in Fort Lauderdale. They handled massive regional accounts managing campaigns for luxury car dealerships and high-end coastal resorts. The email was polite professional and requested an urgent in-person meeting to discuss a potential strategic partnership regarding my proprietary tracking algorithms. I agreed to the meeting, scheduling it for the following afternoon at a sleek, glass-walled conference center near the Intracoastal Waterway. I arrived early, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. The executive director, a polished man named Sterling, greeted me with a firm handshake. He did not ask about my departure from Parker Media, nor did he mention the rumors of a mental breakdown that my parents had circulated. He bypassed the social pleasantries entirely and focused on the data. "We have been monitoring the metrics you are generating for your independent contractors," Sterling said, projecting a presentation onto the large screen at the end of the conference table. "The conversion accuracy of your software is remarkable. It outperforms the generic industry platforms by a significant margin. We want to integrate that capability into our own agency infrastructure." He slid a thick-bound folder across the polished table toward me. "We are prepared to offer you an aggressive buyout for the exclusive rights to the software," Sterling explained, his tone smooth and persuasive. "We want to purchase the intellectual property, the source code, and the underlying copyright outright. The lump sum payment is detailed on page 4. It is a highly competitive offer, Bella." I opened the folder and flipped to the specified page. I stared at the bold printed number. The lump sum offer was staggering. It was enough money to completely wipe out the remaining legal debts I owed Elena. It was enough to upgrade my office space, hire a small staff, and secure my personal finances for the next 5 years. It represented instant, undeniable security. The grueling, exhausting marathon of the past 6 months could end with a single stroke of a pen. I would no longer have to worry about paying the rent or fighting for small independent contracts. The offer was the perfect red herring. It dangled the promise of immediate salvation right in front of me, masking the hidden hook lying just beneath the surface. I closed the folder, keeping my expression neutral. "I appreciate the offer, Sterling. The valuation is generous. I will review the contract with my legal counsel and return a decision by the end of the week." Sterling smiled, clearly confident that the massive financial incentive would guarantee my compliance. "We look forward to bringing your technology into our portfolio, Bella." I left the conference center and drove to a small public park overlooking the ocean. The afternoon sun beat down on the water, turning the waves into a glittering expanse of turquoise and gold. I sat on a wooden bench watching the luxury yachts navigate the channel, the heavy contract folder resting on my lap. The temptation to sign the buyout agreement was overwhelming. The exhaustion of the entrepreneurial grind had seeped deep into my bones, and the prospect of a massive cash infusion felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I wanted the security. I wanted the validation of a major corporate payout. But my survival over the past 6 months was not built on impulse. It was built on meticulous analysis. I was a digital strategist. I did not accept data at face value. I verified the source. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and connected it to my cellular hotspot. I opened the Florida Division of Corporations database and began running a background check on Sterling's advertising firm. I pulled the public records detailing their board of directors, their corporate officers, and their parent companies. I traced the corporate hierarchy upward, navigating through a maze of holding companies and limited liability partnerships. It took 45 minutes of digging through public tax filings and registration documents before I hit the ceiling of the corporate structure. The blood drained from my face. The Fort Lauderdale advertising firm that offered to buy my software was a subsidiary of a massive real estate holding conglomerate based out of New York. The chief executive officer of that conglomerate was Marcus's father. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sudden lucrative buyout offer was not a random stroke of luck. It was a highly calculated trap. My parents, Richard and Valerie, were bleeding clients. The cease and desist order had legally barred them from using my analytics software, paralyzing their ability to deliver results. They were desperate to secure the massive real estate contract from Marcus's father to fund their retirement, but they could not execute the digital rollout without the tracking infrastructure I had built. Marcus's father was a ruthless businessman. He would not hand a multi-million-dollar advertising contract to a failing agency that lacked the necessary technological capabilities. He recognized the value of the software my parents had lost. Sterling and his firm were not trying to help me succeed. They were acting as a corporate proxy. Marcus's father was attempting to acquire my software cheaply through a subsidiary. Once they owned the intellectual property outright, they would likely license it back to Parker Media, solving my parents' operational crisis and securing the real estate deal that started this entire war. If I signed the buyout, I would be selling my armor to the exact people who tried to destroy me. I would be handing my parents the weapon they needed to save their agency, validating the horrific ambush at the birthday dinner. The lump sum payment was generous, but selling the software meant relinquishing control over the only asset that guaranteed my independence. I closed my laptop, the salty ocean breeze cooling the sudden heat in my cheeks. The trap was intricate and well disguised, but it failed because they underestimated my vigilance. They thought the promise of quick cash would blind me to the corporate mechanics operating behind the scenes. I drove back to my small office near the airport and called my attorney, Elena. I explained the corporate structure of the rival firm and instructed her to draft a formal response to Sterling's offer. I did not reject the deal entirely. I used the leverage they had unwittingly handed me. The following morning, Elena sent our counteroffer to the Fort Lauderdale firm. We formally rejected the outright purchase of the intellectual property. We explicitly stated that the source code and the copyright would remain permanently under the ownership of my independent LLC. Instead of a buyout, we offered them a strict, non-exclusive licensing agreement. They could utilize the software for their own clients, but they would be required to pay a substantial recurring monthly licensing fee for access to the servers. Furthermore, the contract included an ironclad clause prohibiting them from sublicensing the software to any third-party agencies, specifically naming Parker Media in the restrictive covenants. They wanted the software because it was undeniably effective. They could not replicate the code themselves without spending millions on development. 2 days later, Sterling signed the licensing agreement. I secured a massive, steady stream of monthly revenue without selling my soul or surrendering my leverage. The financial pressure that had haunted me for 6 months evaporated. The foundation of my independent agency was now set in concrete, insulated by a recurring income that guaranteed my survival. I had navigated the trap and secured my future. But my refusal to sell the intellectual property sent a clear, devastating message back through the corporate hierarchy. Marcus's father now knew he could not acquire the technology to save Parker Media. The backdoor rescue operation had failed. Richard and Valerie were officially out of options. The software was permanently out of their reach, and the slow, inevitable collapse of their agency was accelerating. They were trapped in a sinking ship, desperate for a way out. And that desperation was about to manifest in a wildly unethical, highly illegal business maneuver that would set the stage for a spectacular corporate implosion one I would watch unfold with profound, dramatic irony. The corporate ecosystem of South Florida is fueled by gossip. Information travels faster than a tropical storm carried on the whispered conversations exchanged at high-end golf courses and exclusive charity galas. For months, I had been the target of that gossip, battling the insidious rumors my parents had planted regarding my mental stability. But as the blistering summer heat settled over Miami, the narrative circulating through the industry suddenly shifted. I was no longer the subject of the whispered conversations. My parents were. The licensing agreement I secured with the rival Fort Lauderdale firm provided me with the financial stability I desperately needed. My independent agency was thriving. I hired 2 junior analysts to help manage the expanding roster of clients, and I upgraded my office space to a larger suite that overlooked the bustling runway of the international airport. I was insulated from the chaos of Parker Media, focused entirely on growth and deliverables. But you cannot work in the Miami marketing sector without occasionally brushing against the ghosts of your past. It started with an unexpected phone call on a Wednesday afternoon. The caller was a former colleague, a graphic designer named Julian, who had worked at Parker Media during my tenure. Julian and I had maintained a quiet professional rapport, and he was one of the few people who had not believed the smear campaign my parents orchestrated. Julian called under the guise of asking for a professional reference, but the true purpose of the conversation surfaced within 3 minutes. "Have you heard what Richard and Valerie are doing?" Julian asked, his tone hushed and conspiratorial. The atmosphere at the office is incredibly tense. They are laying off the junior staff and refusing to renew the lease on the Coral Gables suite. I leaned back in my desk chair, gazing out at the planes taking off in the distance. I had assumed the cease and desist order was slowly bleeding the agency dry, forcing them to downsize. "I have not spoken to them in 8 months, Julian," I replied evenly. "I imagine they are struggling to maintain their reporting metrics without the back-end software." "It is worse than struggling," Bella Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They are jumping ship." Richard announced internally that they are in the final stages of a complete corporate buyout. They are selling Parker Media outright to a major holding company. The deal is supposed to close by the end of the month. I paused, a cold wave of realization washing over me. A holding company. Do you know the name of the buyer? Julian hesitated, clearly uncomfortable relaying the information. It is the conglomerate owned by Marcus's father, the New York real estate developer. Richard told the senior staff that the acquisition will provide the capital needed to expand the agency's footprint, but everyone knows the truth. Richard and Valerie are cashing out. They are planning to take the massive payout from the sale and immediately retire to the Florida Keys. They are leaving the agency behind. The sheer audacity of their plan left me temporarily speechless. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a force that made me dizzy. When Marcus's father failed to acquire my proprietary software through the sneaky subsidiary buyout attempt, he realized he could not simply replicate the technology. He needed the tracking metrics for his massive luxury condo rollouts. Richard, desperate to escape the failing agency and secure his retirement, must have convinced the developer that acquiring Parker Media outright was the only way to gain control of the digital infrastructure. My parents were attempting to sell an empty shell. They were pitching the agency based on the historical conversion metrics I had generated using the software I owned. They were trying to secure a multi-million-dollar retirement payout by selling a technological capability they no longer legally possessed. The dramatic irony of the situation was staggering. The following Saturday evening, the irony transformed into a public spectacle. I was sitting in my apartment in Brickell reviewing a campaign proposal for a local craft brewery. I opened my social media application to check the performance of a targeted advertisement I had launched earlier in the day. The algorithm, driven by mutual connections, pushed a series of photographs to the top of my feed. The images were posted by Richard. He was hosting a lavish, extravagant gathering at one of the most exclusive yacht clubs in Miami. The location tagged on the post was a club famous for its exorbitant membership fees and strict dress codes. The caption read, "Pre-acquisition celebration, looking forward to the next chapter and a lucrative partnership." I clicked through the photo carousel. The pictures were a masterclass in performative wealth. Richard was wearing a tailored linen suit holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch. Valerie stood beside him, draped in a designer gown, beaming with a smile that radiated pure, unadulterated triumph. They looked like people who had just won the lottery. The final photograph in the carousel was the most revealing. It showed Richard standing on the deck of a massive luxury yacht, laughing heartily while smoking a thick imported cigar alongside Marcus's father. They looked like two titans of industry sealing a historic deal. I stared at the image of my father celebrating his impending retirement, the glow of the sunset reflecting off the calm waters of the marina behind him. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully outmaneuvered the stubborn daughter who tried to derail his plans. He was celebrating a massive payday, convinced that his future in the Florida Keys was secured. He was throwing a party on the deck of a sinking ship, completely unaware that the hull was already breached. What Richard did not know, and what the smiling faces in the photographs could not comprehend, was the legal maneuver that had taken place just 8 hours prior. That morning at 9 o'clock sharp, my attorney, Elena, had executed a formal legal directive. We knew the acquisition was in the due diligence phase. Corporate buyouts of that magnitude require meticulous forensic audits to verify the assets being purchased. We also knew that Richard, in his arrogance, had likely concealed the existence of the cease and desist order from the buyers, hoping to push the sale through before anyone noticed the software was missing. Elena did not wait for the auditors to stumble upon the discrepancy. She delivered the truth directly to the source. She had formally submitted a comprehensive legal disclosure to the corporate counsel representing Marcus's father. The packet included the registered copyright documentation for my analytics software. It included the original email where Richard explicitly refused to purchase the development rights. And most importantly, it included a certified copy of the active cease and desist order that legally barred Parker Media from utilizing or distributing the software in any capacity. We had detonated the explosive charge hours before Richard lit his cigar. I sat alone in my apartment, the glow of my laptop illuminating the dark room. I watched my parents celebrate their victory on a public platform, knowing with absolute certainty that the legal guillotine was already dropping. The corporate counsel representing the real estate conglomerate would review Elena's disclosure packet by Monday morning. The revelation would immediately trigger a catastrophic halt to the acquisition. The urge to comment on the photograph to warn them of the impending disaster briefly flickered in my mind. The old instinct to fix the problem and protect my family from humiliation surfaced a ghost of the compliance they had conditioned into me for 3 decades. I squashed the instinct immediately. I did not owe them a warning. I did not owe them protection. They had spent the last year actively trying to destroy my livelihood. They had ambushed me, locked me out of my own data, spread vicious rumors about my mental health, and attempted to steal my intellectual property. They had built this trap entirely with their own hands, driven by their insatiable greed and their arrogant belief that the rules did not apply to them. I closed the social media application, erasing the image of the yacht club celebration from my screen. I returned my attention to the campaign proposal for the local craft brewery. I chose to remain completely silent. I focused my energy on the growing client list that I had built through honest, grueling labor. The weekend passed quietly. I enjoyed the warm Miami weather, confident in the boundaries I had established. I knew the silence would not last. The corporate machinery governing the acquisition was about to grind to a violent, screeching halt. The forensic auditors were preparing to dismantle Richard's elaborate illusion, and the resulting fallout was going to expose a layer of criminality that would shock the buyers and force my father into a desperate, terrifying corner. The facade was crumbling, and the upcoming week was going to deliver a twist that would shatter Parker Media permanently. The modern corporate acquisition process is not built on trust. It is built on suspicion, verification, and forensic analysis. When a holding company prepares to spend millions of dollars purchasing a boutique marketing agency, they do not rely on the promises made over cigars at a yacht club. They dispatch a team of specialized auditors to dismantle the target company and examine the wiring. Marcus's father was a man who built a real estate empire in New York by minimizing his exposure to risk. He was ruthless, pragmatic, and entirely unsentimental regarding business transactions. The Monday following the lavish pre-acquisition celebration, the legal disclosure packet my attorney Elena had submitted landed on the desks of the conglomerate's legal team. The timing was catastrophic for Richard. The forensic auditors were already deep into the due diligence phase, reviewing Parker Media's operational assets, client contracts, and technology infrastructure. The auditors were specifically focused on the proprietary analytics software. Richard had structured the entire valuation of the agency around the granular conversion metrics that software produced. He pitched it as the crown jewel of the acquisition, the exact tool the holding company needed to optimize their luxury real estate rollouts across South Florida. When the legal team cross-referenced Elena's disclosure packet with the asset declarations Richard had submitted, the discrepancy was glaring. Elena called me on Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office near the airport reviewing a content calendar for a new logistics client. When I answered the phone, Elena's voice lacked its usual guarded professionalism. She sounded genuinely astonished. "Bella, are you sitting down?" Elena asked, her tone tight with suppressed urgency. I paused, setting my pen on the desk. "I am sitting. Did the holding company review the disclosure?" "They reviewed it," Elena confirmed. And the situation just escalated far beyond a simple intellectual property dispute. We triggered an internal audit, and what the forensic team uncovered is staggering. My heart rate accelerated. I assumed the auditors had simply realized the software belonged to my independent LLC and confronted Richard about his inability to transfer the asset. I assumed the revelation had embarrassed him and stalled the negotiations. I was not prepared for the true depth of my father's desperation. Richard did not just try to conceal the cease and desist order. Elena explained the gravity of the situation, settling into the silence of the phone call. When the auditors initially requested documentation proving Parker Media owned the copyright to the analytics software, Richard knew he could not produce it. He knew the acquisition would fail if he admitted the agency did not own its primary technological asset. She took a slow breath, so he fabricated the documentation. I stopped breathing. Fabricated it. What do you mean? He forged your signature, Bella. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The air in my office suddenly felt thin and suffocating. Elena continued outlining the mechanics of the crime with clinical precision. Richard created a fraudulent intellectual property transfer agreement. He drafted a legal document claiming that your independent LLC had formally sold the exclusive rights source code and copyright of the software to Parker Media for a nominal fee. He forged your signature on the bottom line, notarized it using a fraudulent seal, and submitted it to the holding company's auditors as proof of ownership. I stared blindly on the wall of my office. My brain struggled to process the sheer terrifying audacity of the act. He had not just lied during a networking dinner. He had not just locked me out of a server or spread vicious rumors at a country club. My father had committed premeditated corporate fraud. He had forged a legal contract in a desperate attempt to deceive a multi-million-dollar conglomerate into purchasing an asset he did not own. He genuinely believed he could get away with it. He assumed I would remain silent, intimidated by the smear campaign, and focused entirely on my own survival. He thought he could push the sale through, collect his massive retirement payout, and vanish to the Florida Keys before anyone realized the underlying technology was stolen. He gambled his entire future on the belief that his daughter was too weak to fight back. He did not anticipate that I would proactively submit the genuine copyright registrations directly to the buyer's legal counsel. When the auditors compared the authentic documentation we provided against the transfer agreement, Richard submitted the forgery was immediately apparent, Elena stated. The dates conflicted. The formatting was inconsistent. The forensic team flagged the document as fraudulent and escalated the issue directly to the chief executive officer, Marcus's father, the man my parents had spent a year trying to impress, the man they had humiliated me for at my 30th birthday dinner. The wealthy snowbird they viewed as their ultimate golden ticket had just been presented with irrefutable proof that Richard Parker was attempting to defraud his holding company. What is happening now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The acquisition is dead, Elena replied firmly. Marcus's father halted the negotiations instantly. He is a ruthless businessman, Bella, and he despises legal liabilities. He is not going to acquire a company whose founder is actively committing corporate fraud. He officially withdrew the buyout offer this morning. The house of cards had not just collapsed, it had been incinerated. Richard had built his entire career on optics, leverage, and manipulation. He operated under the arrogant assumption that he could talk his way out of any consequence. He treated people, including his own daughter, as disposable assets to be exploited for his own financial gain. But you cannot charm a forensic audit. You cannot manipulate a forged signature into reality. The system of rigorous due diligence had caught him, and the trap he walked into was constructed entirely by his own hands. Elena let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the reality of the situation to settle. You need to be prepared for what comes next, Bella, she warned, her tone shifting into a protective legal register. Richard has not just lost his retirement payout, he has exposed himself to severe criminal and civil liabilities. Forging a signature on a corporate asset transfer is a felony. The holding company could choose to pursue charges for attempted fraud. Parker Media is bleeding clients. Their reputation with the New York developers is permanently destroyed, and they are facing potential litigation. I understand, I said, leaning back in my chair. The exhaustion of the past year washed over me, heavy and absolute. He is cornered, Elena added, and cornered men are unpredictable. He is going to realize that your disclosure packet triggered the audit. He is going to realize you are the reason the acquisition failed. He will try to contact you. Do not engage with him without me present. I thanked Elena for the update and ended the call. I set the phone on my desk and looked out the window. The planes were still taking off from the runway, ascending into the bright, clear Miami sky. The world outside my office was continuing its normal rhythmic pace, completely oblivious to the catastrophic detonation that had just occurred across town. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumphant vindication. I did not feel the desire to celebrate. The poetic justice was profound, but it was anchored in tragedy. My father had ruined his own life, destroyed his business, and committed a felony, all because he prioritized his greed over his integrity. He prioritized a real estate developer over his own child. The silence in my office was broken by the sharp, persistent buzzing of my cell phone. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my father's name. Richard was calling. I watched the phone vibrate across the desk. I did not answer it. I let the call ring out and go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, an email notification popped up on my computer monitor. It was a message from Richard sent directly to my business account. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single desperate sentence: "We need to meet. Please." The arrogance was gone. The patronizing tone was missing. It was the raw, frantic plea of a man who realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff and the ground was giving way beneath him. The corporate facade had shattered, and the reality of his impending ruin was forcing him to abandon his pride and beg the daughter he had tried to destroy for a final, desperate lifeline. The meeting was inevitable, but the terms of the negotiation would be dictated entirely by me, and the resulting conversation would sever our relationship with final, absolute clarity. The email sat in my inbox, a stark digital monument to a man's unraveling. "We need to meet, please." I did not reply immediately. I let the silence stretch for 24 hours, allowing the panic to properly marinate. For 8 months, my parents had treated me like a rogue employee who needed to be starved out of the market. They locked my access, spread vicious rumors, and attempted to steal my intellectual property. They wielded their silence like a weapon, assuming my isolation would eventually break me. Now the power dynamic was entirely reversed, and I intended to control the pace of the engagement. On Thursday morning, I sent a brief formal reply. I agreed to a 30-minute meeting. I selected a bustling, brightly lit cafe located in the heart of Coral Gables. I chose the location deliberately. It was a highly public, affluent setting, exactly the kind of environment where Richard and Valerie usually operated their social campaigns. I knew my father would never risk a hysterical screaming match in front of his wealthy peers. The public setting was my armor. I arrived 10 minutes early. I ordered a black iced coffee and sat at a small circular table near the large front windows, watching the expensive cars navigate the sun-drenched street. I wore a sharp, tailored blazer, projecting the image of a successful, unbothered business owner. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, betraying my outward calm, but I kept my hands folded neatly on the tabletop. Richard walked through the glass doors at precisely noon. The physical toll of the failed acquisition and the impending legal disaster was startling. My father had always been a man who projected effortless, arrogant vitality. He spent hours maintaining his tan, tailoring his suits, and cultivating an aura of invincibility. The man walking toward my table looked like an imposter wearing his clothes. Richard had lost weight. His linen suit hung loosely from his frame, the fabric wrinkling around the shoulders. His skin lacked its usual vibrant color, appearing ashen and sallow under the bright cafe lights. Deep, dark bags bruised the delicate skin beneath his eyes, and his posture slumped, stripped of the commanding arrogance he usually carried. He looked haggard, desperate, and remarkably old. He sat down across from me without offering a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not order a coffee. He placed a slim manila folder on the table between us. "Bella," he began, his voice hoarse and stripped of its usual smooth baritone confidence. "We need to fix this. Immediately." I took a slow sip of my iced coffee, letting the condensation drip from the plastic cup. "Fix what, Richard?" I asked, intentionally using his first name to establish the professional nature of the meeting. He flinched slightly at the use of his name, but his desperation quickly overrode his pride. "The auditors from the holding company flagged the transfer agreement I submitted during due diligence," he explained. Leaning forward, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper, "They saw your disclosure packet. Marcus's father froze the acquisition. He is threatening to report the discrepancy to the authorities if we cannot provide authenticated proof of ownership within 48 hours. I stared at him, my expression neutral. You mean the transfer agreement where you forged my signature? I clarified, refusing to let him sanitize his crime with corporate jargon. You committed fraud, Richard. You tried to sell my intellectual property to a holding company by faking a legal document. His face flushed a mottled, angry red. I was trying to save the agency, he hissed, glancing nervously at the neighboring tables. We are bleeding capital Bella. The cease and desist paralyzed our reporting capabilities. We lost the hospitality group. We lost 2 major retail accounts. The buyout was our only exit strategy. I needed that software included in the asset list to secure the valuation we needed to retire. I did what I had to do to protect the family. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. You did what you had to do to protect your retirement payout, I corrected softly. You did not care about the family when you ambushed me at my birthday dinner. You did not care about the family when you told the entire yacht club I was mentally unstable. You only care about the family when you need a scapegoat or a bailout. Richard ignored the accusation. He reached for the manila folder, his hands trembling slightly, and slid it across the table toward me. I need you to sign this, he demanded, tapping the cover of the folder. I did not open it. What is it? It is a retroactive intellectual property transfer agreement, he explained, his eyes wide and pleading. It officially signs the rights, the source code, and the copyright of the analytics software over to Parker Media, backdated to a year ago. It includes a non-disclosure clause preventing you from ever discussing the software's origins. I looked at the folder, then back at his desperate face. And the compensation for this retroactive transfer, I asked, already knowing the answer would be insulting. We will pay you a one-time consulting fee of $10,000, he stated, attempting to inject a tone of authority back into his voice. It clears the discrepancy with the auditors. It proves the initial document I submitted was just an administrative error, a misfiled draft, rather than a forgery. Marcus's father will resume the acquisition, we get our payout, and you walk away with $10,000. It solves everyone's problem. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the offer left me momentarily stunned. He had committed a felony. He was facing potential criminal charges and the total collapse of his business. Yet even in his absolute desperation, he was still trying to exploit me. He wanted me to retroactively legitimize his fraud surrender, the foundation of my independent agency, and silence myself permanently, all for a meager $10,000. He still viewed me as a disposable asset he could purchase for pennies on the dollar. I did not yell. I did not throw the folder back at him or cause a scene that would satisfy the curiosity of the surrounding cafe patrons. The anger that had burned inside me for 8 months condensed into a freezing, impenetrable calm. I pushed the folder back across the table. It slid smoothly over the polished wood, coming to rest against his hands. I am not signing it, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Bella, please, Richard begged, the thin veneer of authority shattering instantly. You cannot do this. If the acquisition fails, Parker Media goes bankrupt. We will lose the house in Coral Gables. We will lose everything we spent our entire lives building. You owe us. We raised you. We provided for you. You cannot just sit there and watch us lose our entire livelihood over a piece of software. You did not raise a daughter, Richard, I replied, maintaining direct eye contact. You raised a shock absorber. You raised an employee you thought you could manipulate forever. I leaned forward, making sure he heard every single word with absolute clarity. You forged a legal document to sell my hard work to my ex-boyfriend's family so you and Valerie could retire to the Keys. You committed a crime because you were too arrogant to believe I would ever fight back. You built this trap entirely by yourself. I am not signing away my business to save you from the consequences of your own fraud. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to formulate an argument. He was out of leverage. He was out of threats. The reality of his impending ruin was staring him right in the face, and the daughter he had consistently underestimated was refusing to throw him a life preserver. I am not signing the contract, I repeated, picking up my purse from the empty chair beside me. And I do not negotiate with hostile entities. I stood up from the table. I did not leave cash for the iced coffee this time. I turned my back on my father and walked out of the brightly lit cafe, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully as I exited. I left him sitting alone at the table, surrounded by the wealthy elite he had spent his life trying to impress, staring at a worthless manila folder. The negotiation was over, and the final refusal sealed his fate. The corporate acquisition was officially dead. The holding company would withdraw completely, taking their capital and their real estate contracts with them. The fallout was going to be massive, public, and brutally comprehensive. The poetic justice that had been building since the stone crab dinner was about to rain down on Parker Media, and the resulting collapse would force my parents to face the very humiliation they had tried so desperately to inflict on me. The swift and brutal implosion of a corporate entity is rarely a private affair, especially in a city like Miami, where business and social status are inextricably linked. The consequences of my refusal to sign Richard's retroactive transfer agreement did not take months to materialize. The collapse was comprehensive, devastating, and entirely public. 72 hours after I walked out of the Coral Gables Cafe, the holding company owned by Marcus's father officially withdrew their letter of intent. The acquisition of Parker Media was formally terminated. Marcus's father was a man who fiercely protected his corporate reputation. He was not satisfied with quietly walking away from a fraudulent deal. He ensured that his reasons for terminating the acquisition were clearly understood by the key players in the local market, effectively blacklisting Richard from any future high-end real estate contracts. The story did not stay confined to the boardroom. The regional business journals caught wind of the failed buyout. While they could not explicitly print the allegations of a forged signature without risking a libel suit, the articles heavily implied that Parker Media had failed due diligence due to severe irregularities regarding their proprietary technology assets. The implications were clear to anyone reading between the lines. The poetic justice was absolute. Richard and Valerie had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of effortless wealth and untouchable success. They prioritized their networking connections and their yacht club memberships above their own daughter. Now they were publicly humiliated within those exact same social circles. The rumors they had spread about my mental instability evaporated, replaced by whispers of their own impending financial ruin and ethical bankruptcy. The friends they had schmoozed at charity galas suddenly stopped returning their phone calls. The social isolation they had attempted to force upon me was now their daily reality. The financial pressure immediately following the canceled buyout was insurmountable. Without the capital injection from the acquisition and without the back-end analytics software to retain their remaining clients, Parker Media began to suffocate. Richard and Valerie could no longer afford the exorbitant rent for their sprawling marble-lined office suite in Coral Gables. I learned about the downsizing from Julian, the former graphic designer, who had kept me updated on the office gossip. He texted me one afternoon sending a photo of a moving truck parked outside the Parker Media building. "They are vacating the suite," Julian wrote. "Richard let the last of the junior staff go this morning. They are moving the remaining operations to a shared workspace near the airport. It is over, Bella." They were retreating to the exact same type of cramped, unglamorous workspace I had utilized when I first launched my independent agency. The trajectory of our lives had perfectly symmetrically reversed. I had started at the bottom and fought my way to stability, while they had started at the top and engineered their own rapid descent. But the final, most astounding piece of poetic justice was yet to occur. As Parker Media bled out, my independent agency was experiencing a period of aggressive, sustained growth. The licensing agreement with the Fort Lauderdale firm provided a massive recurring revenue stream. The local contractors and regional businesses I represented were expanding their retainers based on the undeniable success of their campaigns. I needed to scale my operations quickly to handle the influx of new business. I needed established client contracts and operational infrastructure, and I possessed the capital to acquire them. My attorney Elena contacted me with an unexpected proposition. Parker Media is attempting to liquidate its remaining assets to avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Elena explained during a morning strategy call. Richard is desperate to offload the few mid-tier client contracts they still hold, along with their physical office equipment and domain hosting rights. They are selling everything at a severe discount just to cover their immediate debt obligations. I sat in my office staring out at the runway, the irony of the situation washing over me. "Are you suggesting we buy them out?" I asked. "I am suggesting that acquiring their remaining client list aligns perfectly with your current growth strategy," Elena replied pragmatically. "We can purchase their active contracts for pennies on the dollar. The clients are already familiar with the analytics reporting your software provides. It is a seamless transition for them and an immediate expansion for your agency." I authorized Elena to initiate the negotiations through a proxy holding company. I did not want my name attached to the initial offer. I knew Richard's pride, even in its battered state, would likely prevent him from selling his agency directly to the daughter he had tried to destroy. The negotiations were swift and entirely one-sided. Richard was in no position to haggle. He accepted the rock-bottom valuation offered by our proxy firm, eager to secure the cash needed to fend off his immediate creditors. It was only during the final closing process, when the legal documents required the signature of the acquiring entity's chief executive officer, that the truth was revealed. Elena arranged the digital signing. She forwarded the final asset purchase agreement to Richard's legal counsel. The document clearly stated the name of the acquiring corporation, and beneath that, printed in bold, undeniable text, was the name of the authorized signatory, Bella Parker, Chief Executive Officer. I was sitting at my desk when Elena texted me to confirm the documents were signed and the transfer of funds was complete. I had officially acquired the remaining assets, client contracts, and operational remnants of Parker Media. I literally bought the empire they had tried to kick me out of. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. The office was quiet. The afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the room. I expected the realization to feel like a triumphant, explosive victory. I expected to feel the dark, satisfying thrill of total revenge. I had defeated the villains. I had conquered the agency. I was the undisputed victor of the corporate war they had started. But the triumph eluded me. Instead, a profound, quiet sadness settled into the space behind my ribs. I did not ruin my parents. I did not actively plot their destruction or sabotage their operations. I simply established a boundary. I refused to let them steal my intellectual property, and I stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own unethical, reckless business practices. I let the natural laws of corporate accountability run their course, and the resulting collapse was devastating to witness. They had lost everything. They lost the business they spent a lifetime building. They lost their reputation in the Miami social scene. They lost the luxurious retirement they had planned in the Florida Keys. And most tragically, they lost their only daughter, choosing to prioritize a wealthy real estate developer over the person who actually kept their lives functioning. I sat in the quiet office mourning the parents I wished I had and accepting the reality of the parents I actually possessed. The war was officially over. The battlefield was cleared. I had secured my future, protected my assets, and solidified my independence. The chaotic, destructive chapter of my life involving Parker Media was permanently closed. The dust was settling, and the path forward was entirely my own. The grueling struggle of the past year had transformed me, burning away the compliant, eager-to-please daughter and forging a resilient, uncompromising business owner in her place. The success I had achieved was not built on manipulation or inherited wealth. It was built on raw competence, grueling endurance, and the unshakable belief in my own worth. And as the one-year anniversary of that disastrous birthday dinner approached, the ultimate validation of my journey was about to arrive, delivered in a quiet, sun-drenched moment that would perfectly encapsulate the total absolute freedom I had fought so desperately to achieve. The progression of time is the only reliable metric for healing. It does not erase the trauma of a betrayal, but it slowly dilutes the immediate blinding pain, replacing the sharp edges of anger with the smooth, dull surface of acceptance. When I turned 31, exactly 1 year after the catastrophic dinner at the Coconut Grove restaurant, I did not celebrate by hosting a lavish performative party to prove my success. I chose to celebrate quietly, honoring the profound, hard-won peace I had established. My independent digital agency was thriving. The acquisition of the remaining Parker Media client contracts had seamlessly integrated into my existing operations, providing a massive boost to my quarterly revenue. I employed a dedicated staff of 5, operating out of a bright, spacious office near the airport. We were highly respected within the South Florida business community, known for our flawless analytics and uncompromising ethical standards. I had built an empire entirely under my own name, free from the toxic manipulation and the constant suffocating pressure of my parents' expectations. To mark my 31st birthday, I booked a solo weekend trip down the overseas highway to Key West. I needed a physical and mental departure from the sterile corporate anxiety that had defined my life in Miami. Key West felt like another planet. The laid-back bohemian atmosphere of the island was the perfect antidote to the aggressive status-obsessed culture of Coral Gables. I spent Saturday morning walking along the sun-drenched streets, admiring the historic pastel houses and the wild roaming chickens that treated the sidewalks like their own personal kingdom. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and salty ocean spray. I did not check my work email. I did not monitor campaign metrics. I simply existed in the present moment, breathing deeply without the fear of an impending ambush. In the late afternoon, I found a small, unassuming beachfront cafe located near the southern tip of the island. It possessed weathered wooden decking and a corrugated tin roof that offered shade from the relentless Florida sun. I sat at a small table facing the water, the gentle sound of the waves lapping against the shore providing a rhythmic, calming soundtrack. I ordered a slice of authentic key lime pie and a tall glass of iced coffee. When the waiter set the plate down in front of me, I looked at the dessert, a sudden vivid memory flashing through my mind. I thought about the bright orange stone crab claws resting on the crushed ice 1 year ago. The stone crab is a unique creature. When it is caught, the fishermen break off one of its claws and throw the crab back into the ocean. The crab is not destroyed by the violent extraction. It survives the trauma, adapts to the loss, and eventually regenerates a new, stronger claw to replace the one that was taken. The symbolism was potent and undeniable. My parents had ripped away my family, my job, and my sense of security. They had thrown me back into the harsh, unforgiving waters of the Miami corporate scene, expecting me to drown. Instead, I had survived. I adapted to the harsh environment, regenerated my career, and built a foundation that was exponentially stronger than the one they had broken. I took a bite of the tart sweet pie, savoring the flavor. I was whole again. As I set my fork down, my cell phone vibrated against the wooden tabletop. The sudden buzzing shattered the peaceful ambiance of the cafe. I looked at the screen. The caller identification displayed a number I had not seen in months. It was my mother. Valerie was calling. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the incoming call notification pulse. A year ago, that name would have triggered a severe spike of anxiety in my chest. I would have braced myself for a demanding, patronizing lecture or a frantic, manipulative crisis. I would have felt the familiar, heavy burden of obligation pressing down on my shoulders. Sitting on the beachfront deck in Key West, I felt absolutely nothing. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. The deep mourning sadness I had experienced when I acquired their agency had finally faded, leaving behind a vast, calm expanse of total indifference. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button, bringing the device to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice relaxed and steady over the sound of the ocean waves. "Bella," Valerie said. Her voice lacked its usual polished, authoritative sheen. It sounded thin, hesitant, and laced with a profound, quiet desperation. "I am surprised you answered." I did not offer a polite reassurance. I waited for her to state her purpose. There was a brief pause on the line, filled only by the faint static of the cellular connection. "Your father and I are finalizing the move." Valerie continued, her words tumbling out quickly, as if she feared I would hang up before she could finish. "We had to break the lease on the Coral Gables house. We are downsizing to a small condo in Kendall." She took a ragged breath. The liquidation sale of the agency assets barely covered our immediate tax liabilities. The lawyer's fees for the fraud investigation depleted the rest of our savings. We are completely out of liquid capital, Bella. We cannot cover the security deposit and the first month's rent for the new condo. The silence stretched between us. She was waiting for me to step into my old role. She was waiting for the reliable, low-maintenance daughter to absorb the crisis, pull out her checkbook, and fix the problem her parents had created. She expected me to rescue them from the very poverty she had spent her entire life running from. "We just need a temporary loan," Valerie pleaded, abandoning her pride entirely. "Just $10,000 to secure the lease. We will pay you back as soon as Richard finds a consulting position. Please, Bella. We have nowhere else to go." I sat back in my chair, looking out at the endless glittering expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I thought about the forged signature on the intellectual property transfer. I thought about the smear campaign at the yacht club. I thought about the cold, calculating way my father had locked me out of the servers I built, and the arrogant, dismissive email he had sent me years ago when I asked for compensation. I did not deliver a vindictive speech. I did not scream at her or relish in her humiliation. The desire for revenge had vanished, replaced by the cool, unshakable peace of a woman who fully understood her own worth. "I am sorry, Valerie," I said. My voice was calm, professional, and entirely detached from any emotional transaction. I deliberately mirrored the exact corporate language Richard had used to dismiss my hard work a year ago. "Any capital generated by my hardware belongs to my agency. I am not authorizing a payout for unauthorized back-end projects." "Bella, please," she gasped, the reality of the refusal hitting her with brutal force. "You cannot do this." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait to hear her cry. I did not wait for the inevitable guilt trip or the frantic, desperate begging. I pressed the red button on the screen, ending the call instantly. I set the phone back down on the wooden table face down. I took a slow, deep breath, the warm, salty air filling my lungs. The final tie was severed. The emotional debt I had carried for 3 decades was officially canceled. I picked up my iced coffee, the condensation dampening my fingers. I took a sip of the bitter cold liquid, watching the tide roll in against the sandy shore. The water was clear, vibrant, and constantly moving forward. I sat on the beachfront deck, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the island, and for the first time in my 31 years, I felt completely, undeniably free. I often find myself standing at the edge of the water, watching the restless churning tides and thinking about the currents that shape our lives. In modern America, we are frequently swept up in a rapid, status-driven river. We inhabit a culture that increasingly equates a person's net worth with their self-worth and public optics with personal success. From the perspective of a spiritual practitioner observing these modern tides, the story of Bella and her parents, Richard and Valerie, is not merely a tale of corporate espionage or family drama. It is a profound, urgent parable for our times. It holds up a mirror to the darkest pitfalls of conditional love and asks us to examine the very foundation of the traditional family structure. When the pursuit of material security eclipses moral integrity, the family unit ceases to be a sanctuary. It becomes a marketplace. To parents across the country who are navigating the delicate, immense responsibility of raising children, Bella's journey offers a stark warning, but also a beautiful guiding light towards self-improvement wisdom and emotional awareness. If we look deeply into the spiritual DNA of this narrative, we find our first and most vital lesson: children are sacred trusts, not corporate assets. In that sweltering Coconut Grove restaurant, Richard and Valerie committed the gravest spiritual error a parent can make. They commodified their own child. They viewed Bella's romantic heartbreak not as a moment demanding maternal empathy or paternal protection, but as an exploitable networking opportunity to secure a wealthy real estate client. As parents, we must remember that a child is an independent soul entrusted to our care. They are not an extension of our ego, a vehicle for our retirement plans, or a prop to elevate our social standing. When we condition our love on a child's utility, evaluating them based on what they can achieve, who they can marry, or how they make us look in front of our peers, we sever the spiritual bond of the family. Unconditional love within a traditional family structure means holding space for your child's humanity, especially when it does not serve your financial or social interests. Fairness is not just about how we divide our resources. It is about honoring our children's inherent dignity without attaching a price tag to our affection. Yet to understand how a parent could become so callous, we must look at the roots of their behavior. Valerie's cruelty did not stem from a cartoonish desire to be wicked. It stemmed from a deep, unhealed terror of poverty planted decades ago in a rusted trailer near the Everglades. She was so entirely consumed by the fear of losing her wealth that she became willing to sacrifice her own daughter's dignity to keep it. Herein lies a crucial lesson regarding emotional awareness. We must do the grueling, necessary work of healing our own childhood wounds before we pass them on to our children. If we do not cultivate inner peace and actively detach from our past traumas, those unhealed fears will silently dictate our actions. A parent driven by financial panic or status anxiety will inevitably justify unethical behavior under the false guise of protecting the family. We must teach ourselves and our children that true security is an internal state of being, not a number printed on a bank ledger. Furthermore, this story illustrates a universal truth that Richard learned far too late: the universe always conducts an audit. Richard arrogantly believed he could outsmart the system. He thought he could forge a signature silence his daughter with a vicious smear campaign at the local yacht club and sail into a luxurious retirement free of consequence. He relied on the superficial armor of expensive linen suits and exclusive memberships to shield him from accountability. But the universe, much like a team of meticulous forensic corporate auditors, eventually demands the truth. You simply cannot manipulate the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Teaching children to play the game through deceit, corner-cutting, or stepping on the backs of others is akin to building a grand mansion on a foundation of sand. We must guide our children through our own lived daily examples to understand that honesty and integrity are the only sustainable business models in life. A modest, quiet life built on truth will always inevitably outlast an empire built on fraud. We see the alternative to that fraud in Bella's remarkable journey, beautifully symbolized by the Florida stone crab. When a stone crab loses a claw, it does not perish in the turbulent waters. It retreats, adapts, and regenerates a stronger limb to survive. Bella survived the violent extraction of her family and her career. She did not inherit her success. She spent 14-hour days in a cramped, noisy co-working space, relying entirely on her own grit, intellect, and endurance. True resilience cannot be purchased at a boutique or gifted through nepotism. It must be earned in the quiet, unglamorous moments of struggle. When we strip away the superficial safety nets of status, what remains is the unadulterated strength of a person's character. As parents, we must encourage our children to do the hard work. We must allow them to face challenges and experience the discomfort of failure. We should celebrate their competence and their ethical boundaries far more passionately than their financial acquisitions. Stories like Bella's are vital because they remind us that the strength to rebuild is already inside us, waiting to be awakened. If you find yourself resonating with these quiet victories of truth over manipulation, and if you are seeking the courage to establish your own sacred boundaries, I invite you to walk this path with us. Subscribe to the channel Sofia Told Stories. We share these journeys because healing begins when we realize we are not alone, and there is immense power in a community that values authenticity over appearances. We live in a society that constantly pressures us to curate a flawless image. We are relentlessly encouraged to showcase our acquisitions: the perfect house, the perfect vacations, the successful, high-achieving children. But as we reflect on the rise and fall of Parker Media, we are challenged to ask ourselves a much deeper question. What is the true spiritual cost of the image we are maintaining? If your success requires you to spread rumors about your own blood to forge documents in the dark, or to seat your child across from their deepest pain just to close a lucrative deal, you are already spiritually bankrupt, no matter how much money resides in your accounts. To raise whole, healthy, and wise children, we must first become whole, healthy, and wise adults. Let us step away from the relentless hunger for more and return to the quiet, unshakable peace of being enough. Teach your children that the ultimate success in this life is not securing a seat at the wealthiest table. It is having the courage to leave the money on the table, walk out into the humid night, and build a life that is entirely authentically your own. Look closely at your own dining table this evening. Listen to the unspoken words hanging in the air between the clinking glasses. Notice who is being nourished, and notice who is silently paying the bill for the meal. The roles we quietly assign to our loved ones today are the destinies they will wear tomorrow. And when the music fades and the guests finally go home, you are left to wonder, are you sitting in a sanctuary of your own making, or are you just waiting for the auditors to arrive?